In the cold, calculated theatres of 18th century European royalty, a wedding was rarely an affair of the heart. It was a formal transaction, a cold piece of political chess played with titles, territories, and military alliances. Princesses were raised from infancy to be diplomatic currency, and kings were expected to marry for the ledger, not for love. In the grand drafty halls of Westminster, Versailles, and Vienna, hearts were routinely sacrificed on the altar of state interest, and royal bedchambers were often defined by a chilling, lifelong distance behind a facade of public duty. Yet, in the year Mort Bay Salmi Mort, the British Empire would witness a profound anomaly that defied every cynical rule of dynastic survival. A young, newly crowned King George III and an obscured, sheltered princess named Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz were thrust into a destiny they did not choose. They had never met. They had never exchanged a single spoken word nor shared a quiet glance. Their union was entirely arranged across the stormy waters of the North Sea by diplomats and ministers who cared only for bloodlines and balance of power. When Princess Charlotte's carriage finally rattled through the heavy gates of St. James's Palace in London, she was exhausted, terrified, and profoundly alone in a foreign land. Within a mere 6 hours of setting eyes on each other for the very first time, they were led down the aisle of the royal chapel, bound together by holy vows, under the heavy gaze of the British court. 6 hours, a lifetime decided in the span of a single afternoon. By all historical precedents, this should have been the prelude to a tragic, distant, and cold marriage, lived in separate apartments with the king seeking solace in the arms of fashionable court mistresses. But history holds secrets that logic cannot always predict. What transpired between George and Charlotte over the next 5 decades would completely shatter the cynical expectations of the world. From the very moment their eyes met beneath the gilded arches of the palace, a spark was ignited, not of passing passion, but of an enduring, unshakable devotion that would withstand political upheaval, personal tragedy, and a devastating mental darkness that threatened to tear their world apart. This is the story of a vow that never broke. This is the chronicle of the only British monarch who refused to take a mistress, choosing instead to find his sanctuary, his home, and his ultimate truth in the arms of the stranger he married in just 6 hours. To fully appreciate the gravity of this historical miracle, one must first look at the state of the world they were destined to inherit. Europe in the mid-18th century was a tapestry of shifting alliances and simmering conflicts. The 7 Years' War was raging, a global struggle that pitted the great empires against one another, on battlefields stretching from the forests of North America to the plains of India. In London, the British crown was undergoing a major transition. The old King George II had passed away suddenly, leaving the throne to his 22-year-old grandson. Young George III ascended the throne, with an immense burden resting upon his youthful shoulders. He was a young man of high moral standards, deeply religious, and uniquely proud of his English birth, a stark contrast to his German-born predecessors who had viewed Britain merely as a source of revenue. As you listen to this narrative unfold, let the noise of the modern world fade away into the shadows of the past. Imagine the soft amber glow of beeswax candles illuminating the dark mahogany panels of the palace. Feel the cool, damp night air of London creeping through the heavy velvet drapes. Allow the rhythmic, soothing cadence of history to carry you into a state of deep relaxation, where the grand dramas of kings and queens become a gentle whisper, guiding you into a peaceful night's sleep. This is a work of creative historical narrative constructed solely for entertainment, relaxation, and educational purposes. While rooted in verified archives, certain scenes and atmospheres have been textually reimagined to provide an immersive auditory experience. With the weight of a global empire newly rested upon his shoulders, the 22-year-old King George III found himself navigating a lonely and treacherous path within the British court. He was surrounded by seasoned politicians, calculating diplomats, and an ambitious nobility, many of whom viewed the young, idealistic monarch as a blank canvas upon which they could paint their own desires for power. Chief among those who held immense influence over the young king was his fiercely protective mother, Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, and his former tutor, the scholarly yet intensely controversial John Stuart, the Earl of Bute. These advisors had raised George in relative isolation, shielding him from the legendary debauchery and cynicism of the previous Hanoverian courts. They had instilled in him a profound sense of religious duty, moral purity, and an almost sacred view of the institution of marriage. Yet, as the year Motten Beisau turned into Mot Beisau Mott, a pressing and absolute crisis loomed over the palace of St. James's. A king without a queen was an incomplete sovereign, and, more importantly, a dangerous instability for the British line of succession. The Hanoverian dynasty was still relatively new to the British throne, and its hold on power required the immediate, undeniable security of legitimate heirs. The search for a suitable bride for King George III was launched with a level of secrecy and diplomatic scrutiny that resembled a vital military campaign. This was not a quest to find a woman who would capture the king's romantic imagination. It was a clinical, calculated effort to find a specific political and moral puzzle piece that would fit perfectly into the grand design of the British state. The criteria established by Princess Augusta and the Earl of Bute were exceptionally narrow, designed to eliminate any potential threats to their own influence and the stability of the realm. First and foremost, the future Queen of Great Britain had to be a devout and unyielding Protestant, a non-negotiable requirement written in the blood of Britain's past ridges and conflicts. Second, she could not come from any of the major powerful ruling houses of Europe, such as the Bourbons of France or the Habsburgs of Austria. To marry into a dominant European superpower would inevitably drag Britain into complex continental wars and subject the British court to dangerous foreign espionage. The ideal bride had to come from a small, politically insignificant principality, a place that owed its sudden elevation entirely to the generosity of the British crown. Furthermore, the advisors demanded a young woman who was completely untainted by the sophisticated, dangerous court life of the era. They did not want a highly educated, ambitious intellectual who would attempt to interfere in the governance of the empire, draft legislation, or form political factions with rebellious members of parliament. They sought a paragon of domestic virtue, a quiet, modest, and malleable young woman who would be content to remain safely in the background, managing the royal household, engaging in charitable works, and dutifully bearing children to secure the succession. Loneliness began to settle deeply into the young king's heart as he read through the dry clinical reports of various European princesses, fully aware that his personal happiness was being bartered away by men who viewed love as an unnecessary complication in the ledger of statecraft. As the secret dispatches travelled back and forth across the wind-swept plains of Germany, the eyes of the British envoys eventually fell upon the quiet rural duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, nestled in the northern reaches of the Holy Roman Empire, far removed from the dazzling, scandalous lights of Versailles. This peaceful territory seemed frozen in time. It was a land of ancient forests, serene lakes and modest castles, where the nobility lived lives of quiet dignity, free from the crushing debts and moral decay of the larger European capitals. And it was within this sheltered, pastoral world that Princess Sophia Charlotte was quietly growing up, completely unaware that the gaze of the world's most powerful empire had just locked onto her quiet existence. Deep within the tranquil heart of northern Germany, far removed from the suffocating intrigues of London or the glittering decadence of Versailles, Princess Sophia Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz lived an existence of remarkable simplicity and peace. Born in the modest ivy-covered castle of Myro in Motwicham Saumitu, She was the youngest daughter of Duke Charles Louis Frederick and Princess Elizabeth Albertine. The Duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was not a grand empire. It was a quiet rural territory defined by vast, whispering pine forests, mirror-like lakes, and small, close-knit villages where the rhythm of life was dictated by the turning of the seasons rather than the whims of fashion or politics. In this sheltered environment, away from the cynical glare of the wider world, Charlotte was raised with a gentle but firm emphasis on character, piety, and practical virtue. Her education, overseen primarily by her deeply religious mother and a scholarly governess, Madame de Grabeau, was thorough but entirely non-political. Charlotte was not trained to be a diplomat or a ruler of nations. Instead, her mind was cultivated with the gentle arts that brought harmony to a household. She became fluent in French, the international language of polite society, and developed a keen, appreciative eye for drawing and needlework. Her true passion, however, lay in the realms of music and the natural world. She spent countless hours practicing the harpsichord, her young voice filling the modest stone rooms of Miro with old German hymns and the elegant melodies of local composers. She also possessed an innate, intense curiosity about botany, spending her afternoons wandering through the palace gardens, collecting wildflowers, and studying the properties of herbs and plants. This quiet, pastoral upbringing bestowed upon Charlotte a rare quality that the sophisticated courts of Europe had long since lost: an authentic, unpretentious innocence. She was entirely free from the calculated vanity, the biting sarcasm, and the desperate ambition that defined the noble women of her era. She dressed plainly, spoke with a soft, measured sincerity, and viewed her place in the world not as a platform for personal glory, but as a quiet duty to God and her family. She had no grand expectations for her future, assuming that she would eventually marry a minor German prince from a neighbouring duchy, and live out her days in the same peaceful, undisturbed obscurity in which she had been raised. But the winds of fate are notoriously indifferent to human expectations. In the early summer of Mortneen Beitram Salmi Mort, the profound stillness of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was suddenly shattered by the arrival of an official British diplomatic convoy. The quiet country roads were choked with the dust of magnificent carriages, and the small courtyard of the ducal palace at Strelitz was filled with the glittering uniforms of English envoys, led by the sophisticated diplomat David Murray, the Lord Stormont. They carried with them heavy parchment documents bearing the royal seal of King George III, containing a formal, solemn proposal of marriage for the 17-year-old Princess Charlotte. The British Empire, after months of global searching and clinical calculations, had chosen the quiet country princess to be its queen consort. For the young Charlotte, the revelation was an overwhelming, terrifying shock that completely upended her reality. To be elevated to the throne of Great Britain, the most formidable maritime empire on earth, was an honour that defied imagination. But it came with a devastating personal cost. It meant an immediate, permanent exile from everything and everyone she had ever loved. It meant boarding a ship to cross a dangerous, unpredictable sea, toward a foreign land whose language she could barely speak. To a young king she had never laid eyes upon, there were no long letters of courtship, no opportunities to share a quiet conversation, and no modern comforts to bridge the vast distance. There was only the absolute, unyielding machinery of statecraft, demanding her immediate submission to a destiny that felt as vast and terrifying as the midnight ocean. If you are finding yourself deeply moved by this quiet transition from pastoral peace into the grand stormy currents of royal history, and if the gentle rhythm of these ancient memories is bringing a sense of calm to your evening, please take a brief moment to support our journey. Please subscribe to Whispers of Centuries, leave a warm like on this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your beautiful support allows us to keep these timeless embers of human connection burning bright through the darkness of the modern nights. Now let us return to the quiet castle of Strelitz. where the heavy travelling trunks are being packed under the sorrowful gaze of a mother who knows she is saying her final goodbye. The signing of the official marriage contract in the grand saloon of the palace at Strelitz marked the definitive end of Sophia Charlotte's life as a private individual. From that precise moment, her time was no longer her own. She belonged to the history of a global empire. The preparations for her departure were carried out with a frantic, bittersweet urgency. Massive leather trunks were packed with her modest belongings, her favourite music manuscripts, and small tokens of remembrance from her childhood. The atmosphere within the ducal household was heavy with a profound, unspoken sorrow. Everyone knew that in the 18th century a princess who departed for a foreign throne was effectively embarking on a journey from which she would never return. Her mother, Duchess Elizabeth Albertine, whose health was already fragile, looked upon her youngest daughter with eyes filled with tears, offering final, whispered blessings and maternal advice that would have to sustain the young girl across a lifetime of separation. On a crisp morning in mid-August, the royal carriage rolled out of the palace gates, accompanied by a magnificent British military escort. Charlotte sat rigidly against the velvet cushions, keeping familiar landscapes of her childhood, the dense pine forests, the quiet silver lakes, and the small, thatched roof cottages slowly faded into the distance. The journey across the German plains took several days, bringing the convoy to the bustling port town of Stade near Hamburg. Waiting at the harbour was an awe-inspiring sight that underscored the immense power of her new homeland, a grand British naval squadron led by the royal yacht Royal Charlotte. The ship was a masterpiece of maritime engineering, its gilded carvings and towering masts gleaming in the northern sun. Yet to the 17-year-old princess, the massive vessel must have felt like a beautiful prison, ready to carry her into a completely unknown world. The moment the anchors were weighed and the massive white sails unfurled, the North Sea made it clear that Charlotte's transition to her new life would not be an easy one. Almost immediately upon clearing the coastline, the squadron was ambushed by a series of violent late summer storms. The North Sea, notorious for its shallow depths and unpredictable, ferocious gales, became a churning cauldron of black water and towering foam-crested waves. The royal yacht was tossed brutally from side to side, its heavy timbers groaning under the immense pressure of the wind. Inside the dark, suffocating cabins below deck, the environment was one of absolute chaos and terror. The high-born British ladies in waiting, and the German attendants who had been sent to accompany Charlotte, completely succumbed to severe seasickness, weeping and praying in the darkness as the ship pitched and rolled. Yet it was in the midst of this terrifying, tempestuous wilderness that Princess Charlotte first demonstrated the extraordinary resilience and quiet strength of character that would define her entire life. While those around her despaired, she remained remarkably calm. Her deep, unshakable faith provided her with an internal anchor that the storm could not touch. Recognizing that her companions were paralyzed by fear, the young princess did something that astonished the seasoned British naval officers on board. She ordered her small portable harpsichord to be secured to the deck of her cabin. Sitting before the instrument, her delicate frame bracing against the violent tilts of the ship, she began to play. Her fingers moved gracefully over the keys, and her soft, clear voice rose above the howling of the wind and the crashing of the waves, singing old, comforting German hymns. And for 9 long, grueling days the storm raged, forcing the fleet to alter its course 3 times, to avoid being driven onto the treacherous rocky shoals of the coast. Throughout the entire ordeal, Charlotte remained the steady, serene heart of the vessel. She did not weep for her lost homeland, nor did she allow herself to be overcome by the physical terror of the sea. By using her music to soothe her frightened court, she turned a journey of displacement into a testament of endurance. When the weather finally broke and the battered ship sighted the white cliffs of the English coast at At Harwich, on the 7th of September, the British officers and attendants on board looked upon their future queen with a new, profound sense of reverence. They realised that this sheltered country princess possessed the heart of a lion, and that she was more than ready to face the unpredictable storms of the British court. The moment the anchors of the royal squadron finally bit into the solid mud of the English coast at Harwich, the quiet endurance that Princess Charlotte had maintained at sea was instantly replaced by the frantic, thundering rhythm of imperial pageantry. She was given absolutely no time to rest, to wash away the salt spray of the North Sea, or to emotionally prepare for the monumental encounter that lay ahead. The clocks of the British Empire were synchronized to an absolute schedule, and the British court was hungry for its new queen. Charlotte was immediately helped from the rolling deck of the royal yacht into a waiting gilded carriage, emblazoned with the grand arms of the House of Hanover. As the iron-shod wheels struck the English roads, the final leg of her journey began, a rapid heart of the English countryside toward the roaring capital of London. Plafond. Along the entire route through the rolling green hills and picturesque villages of Essex, the British public turned out in numbers that completely overwhelmed the young German princess. Thousands upon thousands of ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, weavers and children, lined the dusty roads for miles. They climbed into the branches of ancient oak trees, crowded onto the stone walls, and packed the balconies of timber-framed inns just to catch a fleeting glimpse of the carriage. They waved handmade flags, played rustic pipes, and scattered thousands of fresh flower petals before her path, their cheers creating a continuous rolling wall of sound that echoed across the fields. For Charlotte, staring out the window at this vast sea of unfamiliar, smiling faces, the realization of her destiny began to take on a physical weight. She was no longer a private daughter of a quiet German house. She belonged entirely to these people, to this foreign land, and to a global empire that she was now called upon to share. As the afternoon of September the 8th wore on, the rural fields slowly gave way to the brick kilns, the crowded tenements, and the towering stone spires of London. The air grew thick with the smell of coal smoke, industrial life, and the humid moisture of the Thames. At exactly 3:00 in the afternoon, the royal convoy rolled through the heavy ornate iron gates of St. James's Palace, the official seat of the British court. The inner courtyard was a dazzling, intimidating theatre of power. Hundreds of high-ranking silk velvets, dressed in magnificent silk velvets, and guardsmen in brilliant skull-embroidered coats, stood in silent, critical formation, their eyes instantly locking onto the carriage as it ground to a halt on the cobblestones. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The cynical courtiers of London were notorious for their biting judgment, and they were eager to dissect every movement of the young, unknown foreigner. When the carriage door was thrown open, Charlotte stepped out into the humid, crowded air of the palace courtyard. She looked pale from the 9 days of sea storms, her petite, 17-year-old frame seeming almost fragile against the grand stone backdrop of the palace. Waiting at the garden gate to receive her was King George III, surrounded by his royal brothers and his highest ministers. According to the strict, unyielding protocol of the era, Charlotte was required to approach the monarch, lower herself to the ground in a formal, deeply submissive curtsy, and humbly kiss his right hand. As she took her first steps toward him, the sheer psychological weight of the moment overcame her. Her breath caught in her throat, her hands trembled, and her knees began to give way under the heavy fabric of her travel gown. But before her knees could touch the cold stone of the courtyard, King George III did something that shattered the rigid expectations of every courtier watching from the windows. He stepped forward quickly, completely ignoring the formal court etiquette, and caught her gently by the hands. With a firm, reassuring strength, he lifted her back up to her feet and drew her directly into a warm, genuine embrace. As he pulled back slightly to look down into her face, their eyes met for the very first time. In that fleeting, unscripted moment, the cold, calculating machinery of dynastic politics completely dissolved. George did not see a political transaction or a distant diplomatic consort. He saw a young woman of exquisite grace, soft intelligence, and a vulnerable, authentic beauty that no painted miniature could ever convey. Charlotte saw a tall, fair, and remarkably gentle young man whose eyes held no arrogance warmths, only a deep, protective warmth. As they stood there, hands intertwined in the centre of the courtyard, the countdown began. The bells of Westminster began to chime the hour, and they had exactly 6 hours before they would be bound together for life. The 6 hours that elapsed between Princess Charlotte's arrival at St. James's Palace and her walk down the aisle were a whirlwind of frantic activity, ritualistic preparation, and profound transition. For Charlotte, there was no time to process the emotional gravity of having just met her future husband, nor could she linger on the comforting warmth of his unexpected embrace in the courtyard. She was immediately swept away by a small army of British dressmakers, tiring women, and high-born courtiers whose sole task was to transform the young German teenager into a magnificent British queen before the midnight bells rang. The modest wardrobe she had brought from her homeland was cast aside, replaced by an astonishingly heavy, opulent wedding gown made of silver tissue and priceless Brussels lace. The bodice was so heavily encrusted with diamonds and pearls that it functioned almost like a suit of armour, its sheer weight a physical manifestation of the immense imperial duties she was about to assume. As the hours slipped away, the palace corridors outside her dressing room buzzed with the arrival of hundreds of aristocrats, foreign dignitaries, and members of parliament, all dressed in their finest velvet and silks. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of powdered wigs, expensive French perfumes, and the smoke of thousands of wax candles that illuminated the grand state apartments. Amidst this chaotic opulence, Charlotte sat quietly, allowing the servants to style her dark hair and fasten the massive royal mantle of purple velvet onto her shoulders. It was noted by onlookers that despite her youth and the overwhelming nature of the environment, she carried herself with a serene dignity that astonished the cynical members of the court. She did not weep, nor did she falter under the heavy gaze of a court that was ready to judge her every breath. She simply prepared herself for the vow. Meanwhile, in his own private apartments, King George III was experiencing a sense of relief and quiet joy that few of his advisers had anticipated. The immediate, genuine connection he felt during their brief embrace in the courtyard had washed away the anxieties that had plagued him for months. He had spent his youth watching the scandalous, fractured lives of his royal relatives, and he was fiercely determined that his own household would be different. He did not see Charlotte as a political pawn or a decorative necessity. He saw her as his partner, chosen by fate. As he dressed in his magnificent suit of gold embroidery, his thoughts were entirely consumed by the young woman who was currently being adorned with the jewels of his empire, wondering if she could feel the same silent certainty that had just taken root in his own heart. As the clock struck 9 in the evening, the grand procession finally began. Under a canopy of starry night and guided by the flickering glow of flambeaux, Charlotte was led toward the royal chapel of St. James's. The weight of her silver dress and the massive velvet train was so immense that she could barely walk, requiring the assistance of 2 royal dukes just to move forward. The chapel was packed to the ceilings with the elite of British society, a sea of faces watching her every step. At the altar stood King George, looking remarkably regal, his eyes fixed entirely on his approaching bride, ignoring the whispers of the crowd around him. As she reached his side, the ceremony commenced, conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, in accordance with the ancient solemn rites of the Church of England. The exchange of the vows was a moment of profound solemnity that silenced the crowded chapel. In the 18th century, These words were often spoken with a sense of hollow formality by royal couples who intended to live completely separate lives behind closed doors. But as George and Charlotte repeated the timeless words, to have and to hold, for better for worse, in sickness and in health, there was a palpable sincerity in their voices that resonated through the stone hall. They were promising their lives to one another, not just before the empire, but to each other as individuals. When the king placed the gold ring upon Charlotte's finger, the marriage was officially sealed. Within just 6 hours of their very first greeting, the stranger from Mecklenburg-Strelitz had become the Queen of Great Britain, embarking on a lifelong partnership that would redefine the very nature of royal devotion. This content was developed with the assistance of advanced reviewed, verified, and edited by the editorial team at Whispers of Centuries, all rights reserved. Until next time, listen closely to the whispers of the past, because you never know what timeless wisdom might quietly find its way into your night. Following the grand, candlelit solemnity of their midnight wedding, the reality of their new shared life began to unfold immediately with the dawn of the morning sun. There was no quiet honeymoon for the newlywed monarchs. The machinery of the British Empire required their constant visible presence. Over the next several weeks, London was transformed into a continuous theatre of celebration, culminating in the magnificent coronation ceremony at Westminster Abbey. On that historic day, the ancient stone abbey was filled with the heavy scent of incense, the thundering resonance of organs, and the collective gaze of thousands of aristocrats who watched as the crown of St. Edward was placed upon George's head, and a custom-crafted diamond crown was set upon the dark hair of Queen Charlotte. It was a display of unprecedented imperial opulence, yet onlookers noted that amidst the glittering sea of gold plate and velvet robes, the young king and queen seemed to draw their strength not from the pageantry around them, but from the quiet, frequent glances they exchanged. Once the public celebrations finally faded and the foreign dignitaries departed, the true test of their relationship began within the walls of the central court of St. James's Palace. The British court of the mid-18th century was a sophisticated, deeply cynical, and often treacherous environment. It was a world where marriage among the nobility was viewed strictly as a legal and financial arrangement, and where genuine marital affection was frequently met with polite mockery or suspicion. The sophisticated aristocrats and politicians fully expected the 22-year-old king to quickly tire of his modest German-born bride and follow the well-established path of his predecessors. For generations, Hanoverian kings had maintained an official, highly fashionable circle of royal mistresses, treating infidelity not merely as a private indulgence, but as an essential status symbol and a necessary display of royal masculinity and power. But King George III was a man guided by an entirely different moral compass and a deep internal idealism. To the complete astonishment and eventual frustration of the ambitious noblewomen and calculating courtiers of London, the young king made it immediately and undeniably clear that his heart belonged exclusively to his queen. He pointedly ignored the subtle, seductive advances of court beauties and refused to establish the traditional position of a royal mistress. He became the first monarch in the history of the House of Hanover, and one of the very few in British history who never engaged in a single extramarital affair. This extraordinary fidelity was not a political calculation. It was a profound daily choice rooted in the genuine, deep-seated love and respect that had blossomed from their very first hour of meeting. For George, Charlotte was his sanctuary, his intellectual equal, and the sole keeper of his affections. This absolute devotion created a beautiful, unprecedented paradox within the palace. While other European courts, such as Versailles, were defined by expensive scandals, public betrayals, and separate royal lives, the private apartments of George and Charlotte became a bastion of purity and mutual support. Charlotte, who was still adjusting to the complex English language, and the rigid customs of her new home, found in her husband a patient teacher and a fierce protector. George spent his rare free hours sitting with her, reading English literature aloud to help her master the cadence of the language, and shielding her from the subtle xenophobia and biting gossip of the courtiers. In return, Charlotte offered the young king that allowed him to completely strip away the heavy, exhausting mask of kingship, whenever exhausting manner he was in her presence. If you are finding yourself deeply comforted by this timeless journey of a love that defied the cynical expectations of an entire empire, and if the gentle rhythm of these historical memories is bringing a serene peace to your night, please take a brief moment to support our channel, subscribe to Whispers of Centuries, leave a warm like on this video, and share your thoughts in the comments section below. Your wonderful presence and support are the gentle hands that keep these stories alive, casting a soothing light into the modern darkness. Now let us return to the Georgian court, where the young king is preparing a magnificent historic surprise for his beloved bride, seeking to build a true home far away from the prying eyes of the politicians. The young king's absolute refusal to indulge in the court culture of infidelity was soon followed by another radical departure from royal tradition. George III recognised that if their love was to truly survive and flourish, it needed a space where the suffocating air of St. James's Palace could not reach. The central court was a place of endless public visibility, where every gesture was analysed by diplomats and every conversation was recorded by ambitious politicians. Charlotte, though remarkably dignified, was still a young woman adjusting to a massive empire, and George desperately wanted to provide her with a private to her that belonged completely to her. In Mortneen Bacham Salmi Mort, his eyes fell upon a large, elegant town house built originally for the Duke of Buckingham, situated at the western edge of London's sprawling parks. It was a handsome structure of red brick and white stone, surrounded by wild meadows and quiet, uncultivated gardens. George purchased the property for £21,000, a monumental sum at the time, and presented the deeds to Charlotte as a personal gift of devotion. It was officially designated as the Queen S House, a title that perfectly reflected its intended purpose. It was not meant to be a grand palace for state ceremonies, foreign receptions, or political banquets. It was designed to be a true home. Charlotte adored the gift instantly. Within its walls, she was finally able to step out of the heavy diamond-encrusted armour of her formal gowns and breathe freely. Together, the young couple began to systematically transform the estate into a sanctuary of comfort, domestic warmth, and domestic simplicity that stood in stark contrast to the hollow, glittering excess of the era's upper class. This modest residence, born out of a husband's desire to shield his wife, would quietly evolve over the centuries into what the world now knows as Buckingham Palace. Moving into Buckingham House allowed to establish a daily routine that was remarkably unpretentious for the rulers of a global empire. They stripped away the endless layers of servants and courtiers who typically separated a royal couple. They chose to sleep in the same bedchamber, a practice that was considered shockingly unfashionable among the European aristocracy, who preferred separate wings of their castles to facilitate their independent lives. In the early mornings, before the dispatches from Parliament arrived, they would walk together through the dew-covered grass of their private gardens, accompanied only by a few favourite dogs. They checked on the nesting birds, watched the stitch rise off the small ponds, and talked about their personal hopes and fears with an openness that was entirely authentic. The interior of the Queen S House quickly began to reflect the intellectual curiosity and refined, gentle tastes of its inhabitants. George, a passionate collector of knowledge, began to amass a massive library that would eventually grow to over 65,000 volumes, covering topics from mechanics and history to agriculture and classical literature. Charlotte filled the sunlit sitting rooms with botanical drawings, rare porcelain from her native Germany, and embroidery frames, where she spent her afternoons working with silk threads. They did not fill their home with gold-plated mirrors to impress visitors. Instead, they filled it verkepite hat books, scientific instruments, and comfortable furniture designed for long evenings spent by the fireside. It was a space defined by the quiet warmth of a shared life, a fortress of domestic peace that kept the cynical, demanding world of active politics safely outside the gates. In this peaceful environment, their mutual admiration deepened into an unshakable, emotional alliance. Charlotte discovered that her husband was not just a dedicated monarch, but a man of profound sensitivity who deeply valued her thoughts and insights. George found in Charlotte a steady, tranquil anchor who could soothe his racing mind after a long day of arguing with his ministers. They did not need the constant distraction of masquerade balls, gambling houses, or court theatre to sustain their relationship. They found their absolute contentment in the simple, quiet accumulation of shared hours locked away in their private house, building a foundation of pure friendship and mutual respect that would soon be tested by the vast, beautiful responsibilities of an expanding family. As the decade of the Motnin Becham Somi Gay progressed, the private life within Buckingham House blossomed into a beautiful, quiet symphony of shared intellectual and artistic passions. Away from the heavy state dinners and the aggressive debates of Parliament, King George III and Queen Charlotte cultivated and refined that was deeply soothing, refined, and entirely illuminated by the warm, flickering glow of beeswax candles. This was the era of the Enlightenment, a time when human curiosity was unlocking the mysteries of the natural world, and the young monarchs were not mere passive observers of this cultural awakening. They were enthusiastic, deeply knowledgeable participants. In the quiet hours after the sun had dipped below the London horizon, the Queen's house became a sanctuary of creative exploration, where the heavy burdens of the crown were forgotten in favour of the timeless pursuit of beauty and truth. The absolute heart of their evening sanctuary was a mutual, profound adoration for music. Queen Charlotte was a remarkably accomplished musician, her early training in Germany having given her a disciplined technique and a deep appreciation for the complex structures of classical composition. Her favourite instrument was a beautifully crafted harpsichord, its mahogany frame inlaid with delicate ivory, which occupied a central place in her private sitting room. Every evening, as the silver candelabras were lit, Charlotte would sit before the keyboard, her slender fingers gliding gracefully over the keys. King George, who possessed a genuine emotional connection to music, would sit close by in a high-backed armchair, his eyes closed, his mind completely surrendering to the harmony. He was a passionate admirer of George Frederick Handel, and together they would spend hours practicing his intricate sonatas, the king often picking up his German flute to accompany his wife, their voices and instruments blending into a soft, private dialogue that filled the quiet palace rooms. Their musical world was also defined by a beautiful spirit of generosity and patronage. The royal couple welcomed their 8-year-old musical prodigy, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, to their home. Rather than subjecting the young boy to the cold, intimidating atmosphere of a formal court reception, George and Charlotte received him with a warm, domestic informality that deeply touched the Mozart family. The king placed difficult manuscripts by Bach and Handel before the young genius, marvelling at his ability to play them flawlessly at first sight, while Queen Charlotte stood close by the harpsichord, singing an aria accompanied by the boyesque performance. This lack of rigid majesty was characteristic of their private life. They viewed music not as a tool for political display, but as a universal language of the soul that brought a profound, restorative peace to their marriage. In addition to their musical evenings, George and Charlotte shared a deep, unceasing fascination with the natural sciences, particularly botany and astronomy. Charlotte's childhood love for plants found full expression in England, where she partnered with her husband to expand the royal gardens at Kew into a world-class institution of scientific study. Together, they spent their afternoons, brought by British ships from the furthest corners of the earth, carefully pressing leaves, cataloguing new species, and studying the medicinal properties of herbs. On clear, crisp nights, their attention turned from the earth to the heavens. George had commissioned the construction of advanced astronomical telescopes, and together with Charlotte, they would ascend to the private observatories, peering into the silent night sky to map the craters of the Moon, observe the rings of Saturn, and marvel at the vast, orderly design of the universe, finding in the eternal stability of the stars a quiet comfort that the chaotic world of human politics could never provide. The deep spiritual alignment that illuminated the quiet evenings of King George III and Queen Charlotte soon found its most vibrant, demanding, and joyful expression in the grand family they built together. Over the course of their long, unbroken union, Queen Charlotte gave birth to 15 children, 9 sons and 6 daughters, an astonishing number that turned their private residences into bustling, chaotic havens of youth laughter and unceasing activity. In an 18th century world where royal children were typically treated as distant dynastic assets, handed over to governors in separate palaces and rarely seen by their parents, George and Charlotte chose a path of radical, hands-on devotion. They were deeply committed, intensely loving parents who viewed the raising of their large family not as a public obligation to be delegated, but as a sacred, personal duty that they wished to experience hand-hand. To ensure that their children grew up had healthy bodies and pure morals, the King and Queen chose to shield them from the decadent excess, the biting asceticism, and the dangerous temptations of the fashionable London society. They established their primary family household at Kew and Windsor Castle, away from the prying eyes of the politicians. King George, despite the immense stress of ruling an empire during a period of global transformation, was an exceptionally affectionate father. He delighted in stripping away his royal dignity to roll on the carpet with his toddlers, listen to his daughters practice their embroidery, and personally map out the academic schedules for his older sons. Charlotte was the steady, nurturing anchor of this vast household, balancing her profound duties as queen with the crushing physical and emotional demands of constant motherhood, managing the nursery with a gentle firmness that earned her the deep respect of her children. The shared responsibilities and emotional trials of raising 15 children knitted George and Charlotte's hearts closer than ever before. Every successful birth was a private milestone they celebrated with quiet tears of gratitude, and every childhood fever was a shared anxiety that they faced together by the dim light of the nursery fire. They found an immense protective solace in their sprawling family unit, viewing it as an unbreakable fortress against the bitter winds of international politics, colonial revolutions, and court intrigue. For over 2 golden decades, their domestic life remained an unblemished sanctuary, a rare and beautiful proof to the world that true, symmetrical love could exist and flourish. Under the heavy weight of an imperial crown, they were not just a king and queen ruling a global domain. They were an ordinary man and woman deeply in love, building a legacy of warmth, intellect, and absolute loyalty. If you have stayed with us through this beautiful journey into the depths of historical devotion, and if you feel a deep reverence for a love that built such a warm sanctuary against the cold currents of empire, please take a moment to honor this legacy with us. Subscribe to Whispers of Centuries, light up the like button on this video, and share your beautiful reflections in the comments section below. Your magnificent presence and support are the gentle hands that keep these timeless stories burning bright through the modern night. Now let us return to the sunlit gardens of Windsor, where the family is embarking on a quiet evening walk, completely unaware of the gathering storm clouds that are preparing to test the strength of their unbroken vow. For over 20 years, the fortress of domestic bliss that King George III and Queen Charlotte had so carefully constructed at Kew and Windsor remained entirely unblemished. Their life together was a predictable, comforting rhythm of sunlit morning walks, botanical studies, and peaceful evenings filled with the gentle melodies of the harpsichord. They had watched their children grow, navigated the complex anxieties of global warfare from a distance, and found in each other an unchanging, absolute sanctuary. To the cynical observers of the European courts, they were an inexplicable miracle. A king and queen who lived like a virtuous country squire and his devoted wife, entirely content within the circle of their own mutual affection. But the wheel of human fortune is notoriously indifferent to peace, and even the most beautiful sanctuaries can be silently breached by the cruelties of fate. As the decade of the Motnim Bedtime gay began to wane, a subtle, deeply unsettling change began to manifest within the private chambers of the king. George, who had always been a model of methodical order, absolute rationality, and emotional self-control, began to exhibit flashes of unusual, frantic restlessness. At night, while Charlotte slept peacefully beside him, the king would rise from his bed, pacing the dark hardwood floors of the chamber for hours under the dim light of a single candle, his mind unable to find the quiet harbour of sleep. He complained of strange, migratory physical pains, a burning sensation in his limbs, and a heavy, suffocating fatigue that seemed to amplify his internal anxieties. To those outside their immediate family, these early symptoms were easily dismissed as the natural consequences of an exhausting reign. The king had spent years bearing the immense, crushing psychological weight of the American Revolutionary War, a conflict that had fractured his empire, invited political betrayal from his closest ministers, and subjected the crown to intense public criticism. Charlotte, watching her husband from across their quiet dinner table, initially sought to rationalize the change in the same manner. She believed his restlessness was merely the heavy toll of statecraft wearing down his physical frame. With a gentle, protective urgency, she redoubled her efforts to soothe him, ordering his favorite dishes, ensuring the palace corridors remained absolutely quiet during his resting hours, and spending her evenings playing his most beloved Handel sonatas with a soft, deliberate touch designed to calm his racing spirit. However, as the autumn of Mort Bay Tam Tam approached, the creeping darkness could no longer be kept at bay by the gentle medicine of domestic tranquility. The king's symptoms underwent a terrifying dramatic escalation that completely defied the comprehension of the royal physicians. The restless pacing transformed into an unstoppable manic energy that consumed his entire being. His speech, which had always been measured, polite, and articulate, accelerated into a relentless, breathless torrent of words. He would speak for hours without a single pause for breath, his thoughts overlapping in a chaotic labyrinth of half-formed ideas, old memories, and distressing delusions. He began to repeat himself hundreds of times, his voice growing completely hoarse, until his lips were dry and covered in a fragile white foam. The gentle father and intellectual monarch was slowly fading away, replaced by an unrecognizable stranger trapped within the agonizing, invisible walls of a mysterious mental affliction. For Queen Charlotte, the dawning realization of her husband's true condition was an emotional catastrophe that shook her to the very core of her soul. She was not merely a queen facing a catastrophic constitutional crisis that threatened the stability of the British Empire. She was a woman watching the slow, agonizing dissolution of her first and only love. The court etiquette of the Georgian era was brutally rigid, demanding that any illness of the sovereign be hidden behind a thick veil of absolute secrecy to prevent panic in the streets of London and political exploitation by foreign adversaries. This meant that Charlotte was forced to bear the initial shattering weight of this nightmare in complete, suffocating isolation. She spent her nights sitting in the dark adjoining dressing room, listening to the muffled, unceasing sound of her husband's As frantic voice through the heavy oak door, her tears falling silently onto the velvet of her gown as she prayed for a dawn that seemed further away than ever before. By the bitter cold November of Mortbay Tammy Tam, the crisis inside Windsor Castle had reached an absolute terrifying peak. The King's mental state was no longer a matter of private family concern or subtle behavioural changes. It had become an unmanageable, violent storm that threatened to tear the royal household apart. George III was now entirely captive to his delusions, experiencing agonising physical convulsions, severe stomach cramps, and a total loss of bodily control that left him physically exhausted yet mentally hyperactive. In one particularly harrowing incident during a royal dinner, the king suddenly sprang from his chair, seized his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, by the collar and violently slammed him against the stone wall in a fit of uncontrollable rage. The prince burst into tears of shock and fear, and the dinner was abruptly dissolved in utter chaos. The secret could no longer be kept. The King of Great Britain was officially declared incapacitated, and the news sent a massive shockwave running through the entire empire. For Queen Charlotte, this period was a descent into a literal waking nightmare that tested every ounce of her psychological and spiritual strength. The man who had broken centuries of royal tradition just to remain faithful to her, the gentle husband who had spent decades reading to her by candlelight, and walking with her through the dew-covered grass of Kew, was completely gone. In his place stood a trembling, unrecognisable stranger who screamed at invisible enemies, held lengthy conversations with dead ancestors, and occasionally looked directly at Charlotte Vercepite hat blank, hollow eyes completely failing to recognise her face or remember her name. The royal physicians, completely out of their depth and operating with the primitive, brutal medical knowledge of the 18th century, demanded that the king be subjected to severe, distressing treatments. They blistered his skin Vercepite hat hot plates, forced him to take toxic chemical emetics, and eventually ordered him to be bound into a heavy canvas straitjacket to restrain his manic outbursts. Every time the heavy wooden door to the king's chamber was locked, and every time his muffled cries of physical and mental agony echoed down the gloomy, draughty corridors of Windsor, Charlotte felt a piece of her own heart fracture. She spent her nights pacing her private bedchamber in absolute despair, weeping into her hands until her throat was raw, her hair turning prematurely grey from the immense, unceasing psychological trauma. Yet, despite the deep terror that surrounded her, Charlotte's love for George never curdled into revulsion or abandonment. She fiercely refused the suggestions of courtiers who advised her to retreat to a separate estate in London to escape the distressing environment. She chose to remain at Windsor, living just a few doors away from his suffering, acting as an invisible anchor for a husband who was drifting hopelessly out to sea. As the king's illness paralysed the government, a brutal, predatory political civil war erupted within the halls of Parliament in London. The Prince of Wales, who had spent his youth indulging in massive gambling debts, secret marriages and open rebellion against his father's strict moral standards, saw his father's tragedy as a golden long-awaited opportunity to seize absolute power. Backed by ambitious opposition politicians led by Charles James Fox, the prince began a frantic campaign to push a regency bill through Parliament. This legislation would effectively strip the mad king of his crown, declare him permanently unfit to rule, and hand over the entire governance of the British Empire to his spendthrift son. The plotters openly mocked the king's condition in the London press, and rumours began to circulate that once the prince became regent, the ageing king would be quietly removed from Windsor and locked away in a cold, isolated asylum far from public view. Queen Charlotte immediately recognised the immense historical danger threatening her husband. She knew with an absolute certainty that George's mind was a delicate, precious instrument that might one day recover, but if he were to awaken from his madness, only to find that his own son had stolen his throne, banished him from his palaces, and stripped him of his royal dignity, the sheer betrayal would completely break his spirit forever. With a fierce protective ferocity that stunned the cynical politicians of Whitehall, the quiet, submissive German princess stepped directly into the political arena. She refused to sit quietly in her grief, launching a bitter counter-offensive against her own eldest son. She demanded a total veto over any arrangements regarding the king's personal care, standing as a solitary, unyielding wall between her vulnerable, captive husband and the circling vultures of the court, determined to defend his dignity until her very last breath. The bitter winter of Motnin Bai Tam Tam bled into the early months of Motnin Bai Tam Chin, turning the grand drafty state apartments of Kew Palace into a silent, frozen battleground. It was here that Queen Charlotte waged her quiet, relentless war against both the primitive cruelty of the medical establishment and the predatory ambition of the Prince of Wales. The King's care had been handed over to Dr. Francis Willis, a man who ran a private asylum and psychological framework built on absolute intimidation and physical restraint. Charlotte was forced into a state of agonizing exile under her own roof. Willis argued that the presence of the Queen threw the king into a frenzy of emotional distress, and he officially barred her from entering her husband's chambers. This separation was a devastating blow to Charlotte's spirit. She was left to wander the cold, uncarpeted corridors of Kew, her feet aching, her mind haunted by the terrifying sounds of the man she loved being forced into submission behind locked doors. Yet even in exile, Charlotte's protective shadow covered the king's entire existence. She established a network of loyal pages and trusted servants who risked the displeasure of the Prince of Wales to bring her hourly, handwritten reports on the king's condition. She demanded to know every detail: what food he had eaten, how many hours he had paced, the exact wording of his delusions, and whether the doctors had used the dreaded restraining chair. When she discovered that the doctors were leaving the king dressed in soiled linen to break his royal pride, she intervened with a quiet, icy fury that terrified the staff, ensuring that the King of Great Britain was always presented with the immaculate cleanliness and dignity that his sovereign status demanded. She spent her lonely nights reading religious tracts and writing letters to Prime Minister William Pitt, urging him to delay the Regency Bill in Parliament, buying precious time for a recovery that everyone else believed was an absolute impossibility. Then, in the middle of February Motbecham Tam Chin, just as the political plotters in London were preparing to pop champagne corks in anticipation of the Prince of Wales seizing the Regency, a profound change rippled through the isolated rooms of Kew. The unceasing chaotic storm within King George's brain began to lose its ferocious power. The rapid, breathless torrent of his speech slowed. His eyes lost their wild, glassy stare, and the agonizing physical tremors that had racked his thinned frame began to subside. One quiet morning, the king sat up in his bed, looked out the tall window at the frosty lawns of the palace, and asked his attendant for a mirror. He looked at his worn face, his long unkempt white hair, and with a voice that was smart and steady, he expressed a deep, lucid sorrow for the immense trouble he had caused his household. The madness had broken. His mind had returned from the abyss. The very first thing the king demanded upon reclaiming his sanity was not a political briefing from his ministers, nor an update on the global affairs of his empire. With a fragile, trembling urgency that brought tears to the eyes of his weathered pages, George asked for his Charlotte. The physicians, realizing that their authority had ended with the king's recovery, immediately unlocked the heavy doors and cleared the path. When Charlotte entered the chamber, she found her husband sitting quietly by the fireplace, dressed in a simple wool coat, his hands resting on his knees. For a long, silent moment, they simply stared at one another across the room, processing the immense, traumatic distance they had travelled over the winter. As George rose to his feet, his limbs weak, but his gaze fixed symmetrical affection that had defined their marriage since Mortine Beacham the affection, since Mortine Bay Salmi Mort. Charlotte broke through her characteristic composure. She ran across the room and threw herself into his embrace. The king wept openly, burying his face in her silver-grey hair, holding her with a desperate strength as he apologized for the invisible terrors he had put her through. Charlotte clung to him, her tears soaking into his velvet waistcoat, feeling the steady rhythmic beat of his heart. Their long winter of isolation was over. They had walked through the absolute darkness of madness and betrayal, and their sacred vow had emerged from the furnace entirely unbroken, stronger and more profound than the world had ever deemed possible. The news of King George III's complete and miraculous recovery spread from the quiet stone corridors of Kew Palace like a wildfire of hope across a weary land. In London, where politicians had been fiercely debating the division of royal power and printing scandalous pamphlets about the King's permanent madness, the sudden realization that the sovereign was once again in full possession of his faculties caused a state of utter political panic among the conspirators. The Prince of Wales and his ambitious allies were forced into a swift, deeply humiliated retreat, their dreams of an immediate regency vanishing into the morning mist. On the night of March the 10th, Mortine Bay Tamchin, the entire capital of London, transformed itself into a breathtaking, dazzling sea of light. Thousands of citizens, from the wealthiest merchants in their townhouses to the poorest labourers in the alleyways of Southwark, spontaneously placed candles, lanterns, and expensive oil lamps in their windows, turning the dark brick streets into a brilliant display of loyalty and joy. The public celebration was a testament to the deep, authentic affection the British people held for Farmer George and his devoted Queen. Church bells rang continuously for days across the realm, their metallic resonance echoing from the grand spires of Westminster Abbey to the smallest timber-framed chapels in the furthest corners of the English countryside. Vast crowds gathered outside the gates of St. James's Palace, singing songs of thanksgiving and waving flags bearing the names of George and Charlotte. For the royal couple, watching the brilliant glow of the city illuminations from the quiet vantage point of Kew, the public display was deeply moving, but their true happiness lay far away from the thunderous cheers of the crowd. It was found in the quiet, simple reality of being able to sit across from one another at the breakfast table, sharing a pot of tea without the terrifying shadow of a locked door separating their lives. To allow the king's fragile physical and mental frame to fully heal from the brutal treatments of the winter, George and Charlotte made a conscious decision to withdraw even further from the stressful, chaotic theatre of active London politics. In the summer of Mortine Bay Tamchin, they embarked on a journey to the coastal town of Weymouth in Dorset, seeking the therapeutic properties of the sea air and the soothing, rhythmic sound of the ocean waves. This coastal retreat became a golden, tranquil interlude in their long marriage. The local residents received them not with rigid, intimidating court protocol, but with a warm, respectful hospitality that allowed the royal family to live with remarkable freedom. The king would spend his mornings bathing in the salt water from a wooden bathing machine, while Queen Charlotte sat on the sandy beach, her sketchbooks open on her lap, capturing the shifting colours of the English Channel under the summer sun. In the afternoons at Weymouth, the old beautiful patterns of their partnership were fully resurrected and enjoyed with a profound sense of gratitude. They would walk hand in hand down the simple esplanade, dressed in plain country clothes, stopping to talk informally with local fishermen, shopkeepers, and farmers about the seasonal harvest or the quality of the livestock. There were no armed guards dividing them from the populace, no powdered courtiers whispering political gossip behind their backs. The citizens of Weymouth were so delighted by the King's recovery that they even hired a local band to conceal themselves inside a neighbouring bathing machine, unexpectedly striking up the notes of God saved the king just as the monarch submerged his head in the water, causing both George and Charlotte to burst into a rare, joyous laughter that echoed across the shore. When the cooler autumn winds finally signalled their return to Windsor Castle, the domestic sanctuary they had built inside the palace was treated as a precious, highly guarded treasure. Charlotte, having learned the bitter lessons of the previous year, established herself as an iron-willed protector of her husband's environment. She tightly regulated his schedule, limiting his audiences with intense politicians, and ensuring that his evenings were entirely dedicated to relaxation, music, and family life. Once again, as the night deepened and the silver candelabras were lit, the music room was filled with the soft, elegant notes of Charlotte's harpsichord, accompanied by the king's gentle flute. They both knew, without ever having to speak the terrifying truth aloud, that this peace was a fragile, borrowed gift, and that the darkness might one day return to claim his mind. But rather than living in constant fear of the future, they chose to anchor themselves completely in the beautiful serenity of the present, deeply content in a mutual devotion that had already proven itself stronger than madness. The decade of the Motnin Bay Chinmigay opened with a deceptive sense of stability within the warm brick walls of Windsor Castle, but outside their private sanctuaries, the world was fracturing at a terrifying pace. Across the English Channel, the ancient monarchy of France was being violently dismantled by the bloody currents of the French Revolution. The news of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette being dragged to the guillotine sent a chilling shockwave through every royal house in Europe. For King George III, who viewed the institution of monarchy as a sacred, divinely ordained duty to protect his people, the spectacle of a neighbouring nation devouring its own sovereigns was deeply distressing. It amplified the psychological pressure resting upon his newly restored mind, forcing him to spend long, exhausting hours in his study with Prime Minister William Pitt, drafting military strategies and reviewing security dispatches to prevent the revolutionary fervour from crossing the sea into London. Throughout this period of global terror and international warfare, Queen Charlotte stood as an unyielding, silent anchor for her husband's fragile emotional state. She recognised that the horrific fates of the French monarchs were haunting George's thoughts, threatening to reawaken the manic restlessness that had imprisoned his mind in Motnin Bay Tam Tam. With a quiet, masterful diplomacy, Charlotte transformed their private family life into a deliberate counterweight to the chaos of Europe. She insisted that within their domestic apartments, the terrifying news from Paris was never to be discussed. Instead, she filled the spaces with the comforting, unchanging routines of the English countryside. She organised lengthy, cheerful family picnics in the Great Park at Windsor, encouraged her daughters to organise elaborate theatrical performances in the Grand Saloon, and ensured that the king's evenings were entirely consumed by his beloved agricultural journals and botanical studies. As their older children grew into adulthood, a new and deeply painful domestic trial began to attest the endurance of George and Charlotte's partnership. The daughters, the 6 elegant princesses who had been raised in the sheltered, moral innocence of Kew and Windsor, were now young women, eager to experience the wider world, marry suitable princes, and establish households of their own. However, King George's deep, protective love for his illness into a fierce, pathological dependency, almost pathological dependency. He could not bear the thought of any of his daughters leaving his side, terrified that the emotional stress of a separation or the foreign dynamics of a distant European court would trigger a relapse of his mental darkness. He point-blank refused to entertain marriage proposals for them, effectively locking the beautiful princesses away in a golden, isolated prison of domestic duty that the girls privately referred to as the nunnery. For Queen Charlotte, this situation created an agonising internal conflict that tore at her maternal heart. She could see the deep, quiet despair growing in the eyes of her daughters as their youth slowly faded away behind the heavy velvet curtains of Windsor. She deeply sympathized with their desire for freedom, remembering her own terrifying yet magnificent transition from the quiet countryside of Mecklenburg-Strelitz to the throne of Great Britain. Yet, whenever she attempted to gently broach the subject of marriage with the king during their quiet walks, she would witness a sudden, dangerous tightening in his chest and a frantic, rapid cadence in his speech that signalled the approach of the dreaded mental fog. Charlotte was forced to make a devastating choice. She chose her husband. She chose to prioritize the fragile sanity of the king over the personal happiness of her daughters, acting as the strict enforcer of his wishes, even as it strained her relationships. Verkepita had her own children and filled the palace atmosphere with a quiet, lingering resentment. Despite these growing internal tensions, the core of George and Charlotte's mutual devotion remained entirely unblemished. They had reached a stage in their long marriage where they functioned as a single synchronized entity, able to communicate their thoughts with a single glance across the state drawing room. When the king's physical infirmities began to increase, his eyes growing cloudy with the early stages of painful cataracts and his limbs stiffening with the onset of severe rheumatism, Charlotte was always there, a constant, steady presence at his right hand. She would gently guide his arm as he navigated the steps of the terrace, read the state dispatches aloud to him when his vision failed under the dim candlelight, and sit beside his bed for hours, soothing his aching joints with lavender-scented oils, ensuring that even as his physical world began to shrink, he was always wrapped in an unyielding, symmetrical love that no gathering storm could ever dismantle. The arrival of the 19th century brought no relief to the aging sovereigns, as the fragile peace they had fought so fiercely to maintain within their private world was once again shattered by the relentless progression of the king's hidden affliction. In the early spring of Mortneen Tam Mort, a massive political crisis erupted in London over the highly contentious issue of Catholic emancipation. Prime Minister William Pitt insisted that granting full political rights to Roman Catholics was essential for the stability of the newly formed United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. But for King George III, this proposal was a direct, terrifying violation of the coronation oath he had taken before God in Motheen Bay Saumi Moat, a sacred promise to uphold the Protestant reformed religion of the realm at all costs. The immense, agonizing weight of this moral dilemma proved too heavy for his fragile mind to bear, and within weeks the frantic, rapid cadence of his speech and the terrifying hallucinations returned with an overwhelming force. For Queen Charlotte, this sudden relapse felt like a cruel betrayal of the years of peace they had so carefully cultivated. Once again, the dark, heavy canvas of the straitjacket was brought out by the physicians, and once again, the king was locked away behind the thick oak doors of his private apartments at Windsor Castle. This time, however, the political landscape was even more dangerous. The Prince of Wales, watching from his decadent residence at Carlton House, immediately mobilised his political allies to revive the dreaded Regency Bill, determined to use his father's mental collapse to strip him of the crown forever. Charlotte, now a tired woman in her late 50s, found herself forced back into the political trenches, her body aching with the early signs of severe arthritis, yet her spirit remaining as fierce and unyielding as a fortress wall as she blocked her eldest son's attempts to access the king's person. To ensure that the king was not permanently replaced by a regency, Charlotte worked in absolute secretive alignment with the loyal faction of the cabinet. She allowed the physicians to conduct their painful, archaic treatments in secret, while she personally maintained a flawless public facade of royal stability, holding elegant drawing rooms and appearing at the palace windows with a calm, measured smile that reassured the anxious citizens of London that their monarch was merely suffering from a passing physical cold. Her daily existence became a grueling marathon of psychological endurance. She would spend her mornings arguing with calculating politicians who wished to declare the king permanently insane, her afternoons managing her weeping, resentful daughters, and her lonely nights sitting on a hard wooden stool outside her husband's door, listening to the tragic, disconnected whispers of the man who had once mapped the stars with her under the peaceful night sky. By the summer of Morton Tam Mort, the political crisis subsided as King George once again staged a remarkable fitful recovery, his mind emerging from the fog just in time to dismiss William Pitt and reassert his royal authority. But the trauma of this second major collapse had left a permanent, bitter mark on the dynamic of the royal household. The old carefree innocence that had defined their early years at Buckingham House was permanently gone, replaced by a constant, suffocating undercurrent of anxiety. Charlotte realized with a devastating clarity that her husband's sanity was no longer a stable harbour, but a fragile, shifting island that could be swallowed by the dark ocean of madness at any moment. She grew increasingly hyper-vigilant, her gentle disposition hardening into a strict, severe discipline as she sought to control every aspect of the king's environment, terrified that a single unexpected piece of bad news could trigger an absolute, irreversible catastrophe. Despite the growing tension and the heavy atmosphere of fear that hung over Windsor Castle, the fundamental core of their mutual devotion remained completely unbroken. When the king's vision began to fail dramatically due to the rapid progression of cataracts, leaving him unable to read the state papers or admire the rare botanical drawings his wife had collected, Charlotte became his eyes. In the quiet candlelit evenings, she would sit, slow and soothing as she read aloud the diplomatic dispatches, the letters from the provinces, and his favourite chapters of classical history. George would sit in the darkness of his fading vision, his hand tightly clasping hers, his thumb gently tracing the smooth gold of the wedding ring he had placed on her finger 40 years ago, finding in her unchanging, familiar presence the only absolute truth left in a world that was rapidly dissolving into shadow. The cooling autumn of Morton Tam High settled over Windsor Castle with a heavy muted stillness, casting long, amber shadows across the gravel terraces where King George III and Queen Charlotte walked hand in hand. The violent political and medical storm that had paralysed the British Empire in Morton Tam Mort had slowly receded, leaving behind a domestic landscape that was profoundly altered, fragile, and intensely guarded. Although the king had once again reasserted his sovereign authority over Parliament and dismissed the dangerous proposals of his ministers, the physical and psychological toll of his second major collapse remained etched into his very being. His vision, which had for decades distant stars and the delicate veins of rare plants, was now a fading twilight, heavily obscured by the spreading grey milk of cataracts. He could no longer read the heavy ink on the state dispatches, navigating his private chambers instead by the familiar texture of the mahogany panelling and the steady, comforting sound of his wife's footsteps beside him. For Queen Charlotte, this period marked a definitive silent hardening of her maternal and royal reserve. The gentle, submissive German princess who had arrived on the shores of England 40 years earlier had been entirely transformed by the brutal realities of court intrigue. And her husband's recurrings, Bao Beng illness. She had seen how quickly the Prince of Wales and his ambitious allies had circled the vulnerable monarch, waiting for any sign of permanent madness to steal the crown, and the experience had forged her into an iron-willed, hyper-vigilant protector. She took absolute control of the king's daily environment, implementing a rigid, protective protocol that effectively anti-pressures of active London politics. Within the private apartments of Windsor, she created an unspoken law, and the terrifying state of gamubas of their eldest son were never to be mentioned, ensuring that the king's remaining hours of clarity were wrapped in a deep, artificial tranquility. This exhausting state of hypervigilance, while necessary to preserve the king's fragile sanity, created a heavy, suffocating atmosphere that weighed directly upon their remaining daughters. Princess Augusta, Princess Elizabeth, and Princess Mary, now mature women in their 30s, found themselves permanently imprisoned within the gilded, silent boundaries of the royal household. King George's deep, protective love for his daughters had mutated through the trauma of his illness into a fierce, almost desperate psychological dependency. He could not bear the thought of any of them leaving his side, terrified that the emotional shock of a separation would trigger another descent into the howling abyss of his madness. He point-blank refused to entertain any marriage alliances for them, effectively locking the beautiful, intelligent princesses away in an isolated domestic prison that the young women privately and bitterly referred to as the nunnery. For Queen Charlotte, the sight of her daughter's fading youth was a source of constant, unutterable maternal grief. She deeply understood their desire for freedom, remembering her own terrifying yet magnificent transition of Mecklenburg-Strelitz to the throne of Great Britain. Yet, whenever she attempted to gently broach the subject of a potential suitor during her quiet moments with the king, she would witness a dangerous tightening in his chest, a sudden trembling in his hands, and a rapid, frantic cadence in his speech that signaled the approach of the dreaded mental fog. Forced to make an agonizing choice between the personal happiness of her children and the mental stability of her husband, Charlotte chose her George. She became the strict, unyielding enforcer of his isolation, suppressing her daughter's rebellion with an icy firmness that slowly introduced a quiet, lingering undercurrent of resentment into the family dinner table. Despite these growing internal tensions, the core of George and Charlotte's mutual devotion, functioning as a single synchronized entity against the cold currents of the world. In the quiet morning hours, as the silver candelabras flickered against the gloomy Berkshire fog, the library became their shared sanctuary. Because George could no longer see the parchment, Charlotte became his voice and his eyes, reading aloud the agricultural journals, the historical treatises, and the diplomatic reports from the continents. George would sit perfectly still in his high-backed armchair, his head slightly bowed in intense concentration, his worn, trembling hand resting securely inside Charlotte's smooth grasp. In the simple, unchanging warmth of her touch, the blind monarch found a profound certainty that the chaotic, shifting politics of his vast empire could never provide anchors entirely in a love that had already outlived the innocence of their youth. As the year Motnin Tambay unfolded, the fragile so fiercely guarded within the stone walls of Windsor Castle was confronted by a terrifying external reality. The short-lived peace of Amiens collapsed, and Great Britain found itself locked in a definitive existential struggle against the soaring, predatory ambitions of Napoleon Bonaparte. Across the English Channel, the French Emperor was assembling a massive invasion army at Boulogne, their flat-bottomed boats waiting for a favourable wind to cross the narrow strip of sea and march upon the streets of London. The British populace was gripped by a wave of intense patriotic anxiety, and the immense, crushing responsibility of national defence fell squarely back onto the worn shoulders of King George III. Despite his failing health and the thickening grey fog of his cataracts, the old king felt a profound, divinely ordained duty to stand as the visible symbol of his people's resistance, throwing his remaining physical energy into reviewing military dispatches and inspecting local volunteer regiments. For Queen Charlotte, this sudden escalation of national crisis felt like a cruel, calculated assault upon her husband's precarious mental stability. She knew with an absolute, terrifying certainty that the psychological pressure of a potential French invasion combined with the heavy unceasing workload of statecraft, was a dangerous catalyst that could easily plunge George back into the frantic, screaming abyss of his hidden bow-begging illness. Her hypervigilance reached a near-obsessment level. She spent her mourning the exact cadence of his speech for any signs of acceleration, a cadence, and quietly working behind the scenes with Prime Minister Henry Addington to ensure that only the most necessary, non-alarmist dispatches were brought to the royal study. Her entire existence became an exhausting, solitary shield, designed to absorb the shocks of a fractured world before they could damage the fragile machinery of her husband's mind. The tension within their private apartments was further amplified by a bitter public dispute regarding the military role of their eldest son. The Prince of Wales, eager to cultivate a public image of martial heroism that would rival his father's popularity, launched a frantic campaign demanding a high-ranking military command within the regular army. King George, deeply aware of his son's reckless extravagance, lack of discipline and history of political betrayal, point-blank refused the request, offering him instead a purely ceremonial role within a local militia. The prince reacted with a public fury, publishing his private angry correspondence with his father in the London newspapers, effectively inviting the entire nation to witness the deep, poisonous fracture within the House of Hanover. Charlotte was forced to bear the emotional shrapnel of this public betrayal, watching as her husband's hands trembled with an uncontrollable rage as he listened to his son's mocking words being read aloud from the mourning prince. In the middle of this escalating nightmare, the internal sanctuary of Windsor Castle grew increasingly dark, cold, and claustrophobic for the remaining princesses. Princess Augusta and Princess Elizabeth, now trapped in the quiet routine of the nunnery, found themselves serving as secondary sentries in their mother's domestic fortress. The old king's dependency on their physical presence had intensified to a pathological degree. He required them to be visible shadows within his shrinking, blurry world, frequently calling for them in the dark hours of the night, just to hear the familiar, reassuring tone of their voices. The princesses managed their quiet, bitter resentment with a dignified grace, spending their long, drafty afternoons sketching the ancient oaks of the great park, or playing melancholy sonatas on the harpsichord, their personal dreams of freedom and love entirely sacrificed, so that their father's mind might remain anchored in the light of sanity. As the winter of Mortmain Tam Bay deepened, the king and queen found their only true solace in the quiet candlelit hours they shared after the rest of the household had retired to sleep. Because George's vision was now so severely compromised that he could no longer distinguish the features of his wife's face, he would sit close beside her by the roaring library fire, his senses heightened to the subtle sounds of her breathing and the rustle of her silk skirts. He would gently take her arthritic hand, his fingers tracing the smooth, worn contours of the gold wedding band he had bade him in Herbe Saumi pour Mot, finding in that simple touch a timeless, unyielding certainty. They were two aging, battle-worn souls sitting at the edge of a fracturing continent, entirely aware that the long winter of their lives was closing in, yet remaining absolutely secure in a symmetrical devotion that no emperor across the sea could ever hope to conquer. The fragile dam that Queen Charlotte had so desperately constructed around her husband, sanity finally ruptured in the early months of Mortmain Tam II, the relentless compounding pressures of the Napoleonic invasion threat, the public betrayals by the Prince of Wales, and the exhausting workload of statecraft proved an unbearable weight for the king's delicate mental machinery. By February, the terrifying, familiar symptoms returned with a devastating, explosive force. King George's speech, acceleratorless, chaotic torrent that lasted for 20 hours without a single pause for rest. His eyes reassumed that wild, glassy stare of a man looking into a howling abyss, and he began to hold long weeping conversations, verkepite hat, dead ministers and invisible spirits, the King of Great Britain had once again lost his anchor, drifting completely out into the dark ocean of his mysterious Baobeng illness, and the royal household was instantly plunged back into a state of frantic, quiet terror. For Queen Charlotte, this third major collapse was an emotional and psychological catastrophe that tested the very limits of her endurance. But unlike the previous crisis of Morton Bay Tam Tam, she was no longer a frightened, isolated foreign princess. She was a battle-hardened queen who thoroughly understood the predatory nature of the court. The Prince of Wales immediately moved to seize absolute power, mobilising his political allies in Parliament to declare a full regency and attempting to gain control over the King's person. Charlotte stood as a solitary, unyielding wall against her eldest son, her body aching with the burning fire of advanced arthritis, yet her spirit remaining as fierce as a fortress. She locked herself and her daughters within the private apartments of Windsor Castle, point blank refusing to allow the prince or his calculating politicians to cross the threshold or gaze upon the vulnerable, delirious monarch. The domestic nightmare inside the castle was further darkened by the arrival of a new faction of physicians, who brought with them the brutal, coercive medical practices of the era. They demanded that the king be subjected to severe physical restraints, placing him in the heavy canvas straitjacket and confining him to the dreaded restraining chair to break his manic outbursts. Every time the heavy oak door to the king's chamber was locked, and every time his muffled hoarse cries of agony echoed down the draughty stone corridors, Charlotte felt a piece of her own heart fracture into ash. She could not bear the thought of the man who had loved her, with an absolute lifelong fidelity, being treated like a dangerous animal under her own roof. She spent her days in a state of hyper-vigilant warfare with the doctors, fiercely regulating their access, demanding that his immaculate cleanliness be maintained, and ensuring that no servant or orderly stripped him of the royal dignity that his sovereign status required. This constant, grueling state of psychological trauma and defensive warfare took a devastating toll on the atmosphere within the family circle, particularly for the princesses trapped in the nunnery. Princess Augusta and Princess Elizabeth were forced to serve as secondary guards in this domestic fortress, their own tears falling silently over their embroidery frames as they listened to their father's frantic voice through the wood panelling. The old carefree innocence that had defined their early years at Buckingham House, replaced by a suffocating, claustrophobic routine of anxiety and defensive secrecy. Yet despite the deep undercurrent of sorrow and the hardening of Charlotte disposition, her fundamental devotion to George remained entirely untouched. She lived solely for his protection, finding her only purpose in preserving his peace against the circling vultures of the court. By the summer of Morton Tam II, through a miraculous display of physical resilience, the dark astonished the entire empire, the king's brain began to slowly recede, allowing his mind to step back into the light of clarity. When he finally emerged from his chambers, thinned, weak, and with his vision further diminished by the cataracts, the very first thing he did was reach out through the blurry twilight for his Charlotte. When his trembling hand found hers, he did not speak of politics or the French army across the sea. He simply drew her close, his voice dropping to a low, emotional whisper as he thanked her for keeping Verkep a terre chère hat over his dignity through the long night. They had walked through the furnace of madness and betrayal once again, and though they were weathered, bent, and exhausted by the years, their sacred marriage vow remained completely unbroken, an absolute certainty in a world that was rapidly dissolving into shadow. The slow, fragile dawn of Morton Tam brought with it a quiet, heavily guarded interlude of domestic healing within the massive stone walls of Windsor Castle, which, having narrowly escaped the jaws of a full political regency during the terrifying mental collapse of the previous, King George III and Queen Charlotte clung to the familiar, comforting routines of their early life from desperate intensity. The king's mind had emerged from the chaotic fog, but his physical world was rapidly and irreversibly shrinking. The cataracts that had long plagued his eyes had now advanced to a state of near-total darkness, reducing his sight to mere perception of strong light and blurry, floating shapes against the window pane. Yet, rather than surrendering to despair, the old monarch adapted with a quiet, stubborn resilience. He learned to navigate his vast library by counting the rows of books by touch, his sensitive fingers memorizing the precise texture of the leather bindings and the ornate gold leaf on the spines. For Queen Charlotte, this period required a delicate, masterful balancing act that stretched her emotional capacities to their absolute limit. She was a woman carrying the invisible, bleeding scars of 3 major of a 4th relapse, and the constant fear of a 4th hovered over her thoughts like an unyielding storm cloud. She realized that while George's mind was currently lucid, it was a finely tuned instrument that could be shattered by the slightest emotional tremor. To prevent this, she transformed herself into an absolute filter for all incoming reality. She established a private chamber outside the king's study, where she and the loyal Prime Minister, William Pitt, who had returned to office to guide the nation through the ongoing war with France, would privately review the urgent war dispatches. Together, they quietly stripped away the most alarming details of Napoleon's naval movements, before presenting a calmed, simplified brief to the blind sovereign. This state of constant hypervigilance and artificial peace, while protective of the king, silent, melancholic isolation, Mossen of the princesses within the nunnery. Princess Augusta and Prince Elizabeth, now well into their 30s, kept at their youth, entirely spent behind the heavy velvet draperies of Windsor, found that even the temporary recovery of their father brought no liberation. The king's emotional dependency on his daughters had only intensified with his blindness. He required them to be constant, vocal landmarks in his darkness. He would frequently summon them to his side, merely to have them describe the colour of the afternoon sky, the layout of the flowers in the terrace gardens, or the clothing worn by the foreign diplomats at court. The princesses executed these duties with a flawless, heartbreaking grace, their quiet sighs of unfulfilled dreams echoing through the draughty saloons, their lives completely subsumed by the monumental task of keeping their father anchored in sanity. Seeking to inject a fragment of genuine joy into this heavily controlled environment, King George requested that the royal music rooms be prepared for a series of small, highly private evening concerts. He could no longer see the keys of his beloved flute, nor could he read the sheet music of his revered master, George Friedrich Handel, but his auditory world remained sharp, vibrant, and deeply tied to his happiest memories. In these candlelit evenings, away from the prying eyes of the London politicians, the old patterns of Buckingham House were tenderly resurrected. Queen Charlotte would sit at her harpsichord, her arthritic fingers moving with a slow, deliberate precision across the ivory keys, accompanied by a small ensemble of trusted court musicians. The high vaulted ceilings of Windsor would fill with the sweeping, majestic chords of Handel's sonatas, cutting through the gloomy Berkshire fog that pressed against the glass. As the music soared through the room, King George would sit perfectly still in his high-backed arms closed, his weathered face softened by a profound sense of inner peace. He would reach across the small space dividing their chairs, and his trembling hand found Charlotte fingers resting during a pause in the performance. He would press her hand against his heart, his voice dropping to a low, emotional murmur as the music played on, finding in her familiar, unchanging presence the only absolute truth left in a world that was rapidly dissolving into shadow. They were 2 battle-worn souls who had weathered the storms of madness, political betrayal, and global warfare, sitting together in the fading twilight of their shared century, completely secure in a symmetrical devotion, that remained entirely unbroken by the darkness. The late autumn of 1489 brought a monumental historic tremor from the open seas that reverberated through the thick stone walls of Windsor Castle, testing the fragile emotional equilibrium that Queen Charlotte had so carefully constructed. In November, official couriers arrived at the palace bearing urgent, black-sealed dispatches containing the momentous news of the Battle of Trafalgar. The Royal Navy had achieved a supreme decisive triumph over the combined fleets of France and Spain, permanently destroying Napoleon Bonaparte's dreams of invading the British Isles. Yet the price of this ultimate victory was devastatingly. Admiral Lord Nelson, the nation's idolised naval hero, had been killed in the final hours of the clash aboard the HMS Victory. The entire British Empire was instantly plunged into a contradictory state of ecstatic national celebration and profound, weeping public grief, a volatile atmospheric shift that threatened to disturb the artificial tranquility of the King's private sanctuary. For Queen Charlotte, the arrival of this massive historical milestone was a source of intense psychological anxiety. She recognised with an absolute terrifying clarity that the emotional magnitude of Nelson's death, combined with the chaotic roar of the victory celebrations echoing from London, could easily overload her husband's delicate mental machinery. Working in a state of hyper-vigilant coordination with her daughters, Charlotte structured a careful, deliberate strategy to present the news to the blind monarch. When the Prime Minister entered the royal study, Charlotte stood close by the King's armchair, her hand resting firmly upon his shoulder to provide a physical anchor as the dispatch was read aloud. The old king listened to the account of the battle in absolute motionless silence, his blind eyes staring blankly into the shadows of his room, his thinned frame absorbing the shock of losing his greatest military protector. Rather than collapsing into the frantic, breathless cadence of his hidden bow-bang illness, King George responded with a profound, lucid sorrow that deeply moved everyone present in the chamber. He wept openly for Nelson, his tears falling silently onto his velvet waistcoat as he murmured that the victory was bought at a price far too heavy for his kingdom to bear. Seeking to prevent his mind from dwelling too deeply on the tragedy of the war, Charlotte immediately mobilized the family into a routine of quiet domestic commemoration. She organized a small private memorial service within St. George Chapel at Windsor, ensuring that only the immediate family and a few trusted clergy were present. In the draughty candlelit nave, the royal family stood together as a silent fortress, their quiet prayers rising into the vaulted stone rafters, away from the prying eyes of London politicians and the sensationalist press. This period of national crisis, however, continued to demand an unyielding, exhausting sacrifice from the princesses living within the nunnery. Princess Augusta and Princess Elizabeth were required to serve as constant emotional shock absorbers for their father's grief, spending their long afternoons reading aloud the extensive biographies of Lord Nelson and the tactical maps of the Mediterranean Sea. The old king's psychological dependency on his daughters had reached a state of near absolute necessity. He could not tolerate their absence for more than a few hours, terrified that if their voices fell silent, he would be left entirely abandoned in the terrifying permanent darkness of his blindness. The princesses managed their quiet internal despair with a dignified, heartbreaking grace, their personal aspirations were completely rendered to maintain the fragile illusion of stability that kept their father anchored in the light of sanity. As the winter of 1489 gave way to the early months of 1490, the king and queen found their ultimate solace in the quiet pastoral spaces of the Windsor estate, because George could no longer look upon the physical reality of his kingdom. Charlotte became his primary link to the natural world. During their slow afternoon carriage rides through the ancient oak forests of the Great Park, she would describe with an intricate, poetic detail the changing of the seasons, The way the frosty morning rime clung to the bark of the old trees, the flight of the deer across the brown ferns, and the pale George would sit close beside her beneath a heavy wool plaid, his hand tightly clasping hers, finding in the familiar, steady cadence of her voice an absolute, unshakable certainty that no historical storm or continental war could ever hope to dismantle. The early months of Motneen Tam Sao brought yet another devastating historical blow to the gates of Windsor castles, further thinning the ranks of those who had stood as loyal defenders of the old king's peace. In January, the brilliant and unyielding Prime Minister William Pitt, completely exhausted by the relentless psychological warfare against Napoleon and the strain of national leadership, passed away at the tragically young age of 46. His death threw the political landscape of London into an absolute state of chaos, forcing the blind king to accept a new, deeply uncomfortable coalition government known as the Ministry of All the Talents. For King George III, this political shift was not merely an administrative inconvenience. It was a profound, deeply distressing moral trial. The new cabinet included radical politicians who once again sought to resurrect the highly contentious issue of Catholic emancipation, a proposal that the king viewed as a direct, terrifying violation of his sacred coronation oath. For Queen Charlotte, the arrival of this new political faction inside the royal audience chambers represented an immediate existential threat to her husband's hard-won mental stability. She recognized with an absolute, hyper-vigilant clarity that the intense, manipulative arguments of these new ministers could easily overload the delicate, repaired neural pathways of George's brain, triggering a fourth catastrophic descent into his hidden Baobeng illness. The Queen's defensive operations reached a level of unprecedented rigor. She established herself as an immovable gatekeeper in the private apartments of Windsor, tightly regulating the schedule of royal audiences, and ensuring that no minister was ever left entirely alone with the blind sovereign. Every official document was first brought to her small sitting room, where she and her daughters would carefully analyze its contents, preparing the king for the political demands of the day with a calculated protective precision. This constant state of high-stakes political defense further intensified the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of confinement that defined life within the nunnery. Princess Augusta and Princess Elizabeth, now entering their late 30s, with their personal dreams of independent lives entirely buried beneath the stone floors of Windsor, found themselves serving as essential legal and psychological clerks in their mother's defensive fortress. The old king's dependency on his daughters had become a permanent, unyielding fixture of his existence. Because he could no longer read the faces of his political opponents, or see the layout of the state papers, he required the princesses to sit quietly in the corner of his audience room, using their sharp eyes to analyze the subtle body language of the visiting politicians and using their steady voices to read aloud the dense, confusing legal briefs from Parliament. The internal family tensions were further exacerbated by the ongoing reckless behaviours of the Prince of Wales, who took every opportunity to publicly align himself with the new radical ministry, openly mocking his father's rigid moral principles and religious devotion. The princess' decadent residence at Carlton House became a hotbed of political gossip and scandalous anti-royal pamphlets, forcing Queen Charlotte to bear the immense emotional shrapnel of her eldest son's relentless betrayal. She watched with a quiet, breaking heart as her husband's thin hands would tremble with an uncontrollable, silent rage whenever the whispered reports of the prince's public insults managed to penetrate the thick oak doors of the private apartments. Yet, through the sheer strength of her iron-willed discipline, she managed to keep the family facade completely flawless, refusing to allow a single crack of domestic vulnerability to show to the outside world. As the summer of Motneen Sao gave way to the crisp, golden winds of autumn, marking the 45th anniversary of their coronation, the aging king and queen found their only absolute refuge within the quiet sacred sanctuary of St. George S. Chapel. In the early morning hours, before the powdered courtiers and ambitious politicians could arrive from London, the royal couple would sit close together in the carved wooden stalls of the choir. Because George S.'s vision was now entirely reduced to a dark, featureless twilight, he would lean his head close to Charlotte S.'s shoulder, his senses heightened to the soft, rhythmic rustle of her silk gown and the comforting scent of lavender that always enveloped her. He would tightly clasp her arthritic fingers within his worn hand, finding in her familiar, unchanging presence a profound, unshakable certainty that no political storm, nor the cruel betrayals of their children, could ever hope to dismantle, absolutely secure in a love that remained entirely undefeated by the passing centuries. The arrival of the year Mortneen Tamlen Bay brought a monumental, historic triumph of human dignity to the British Empire, providing a rare ray of moral light that penetrated the otherwise gloomy and heavily guarded chambers of Windsor Castle. In March of that year, after decades of relentless, grueling activism led by William Wilberforce, Parliament officially passed the Slave Trade Act, legally abolishing the brutal transatlantic slave trade across the vast oceans of the British realm. For King George III, whose traditionalist mind had long feared that any sudden radical societal change would disrupt the divine order of his kingdom, the final passage of the act was a moment of profound, quiet contemplation, as he sat in the dark twilight of his near-total blindness, listening to the soaring emotional speeches of the abolitionists being read aloud to him by his daughters. He experienced a deep shift in his own understanding, recognizing that this act of mercy was a supreme fulfillment of his nation's oath to govern his people with justice and righteousness under God. For Queen Charlotte, this historic milestone provided a vital, brief distraction from the exhausting labour of managing her husband's delicate mental health. She recognized that the old king's mind was deeply comforted by the knowledge that his empire had taken a stand against such a profound moral darkness, and she instantly capitalized on this positive emotional energy to reinforce the eternal stability of their household. She organized a small private gathering in the castle library, inviting Wilberforce's closest allies to discuss the future of the freed families, ensuring that the atmosphere surrounding the blind monarch was filled with constructive, peaceful thoughts rather than the terrifying, chaotic news of Napoleon's continuing military conquests across continental Europe. Her hypervigilance remained as strict as a fortress wall, but for a few short weeks, her severe defensive mask was softened by a genuine sense of shared royal pride. However, just outside the quiet library, the heavy, claustrophobic atmosphere of the nunnery continued to demand a devastating, silent sacrifice from the remaining princesses. Princess Augusta and Princess Elizabeth, now entering their late 30s and early 40s respectively, watched with a quiet, breaking heart as the years of their youth vanished completely behind the thick stone walls of Windsor Castle. The king's psychological dependency on their physical and vocal presence had reached a state of near absolute pathological necessity, because he could no longer see the furniture or read the expressions of those around him. His daughters' voices served as his primary structural navigation within the room. They spent their long, drafty afternoons reading aloud the extensive transcripts of parliamentary debates and updating the king on the progress of his agricultural estates, their own personal dreams of independent homes, marital affection, and children the fragile illusion of stability that kept their father anchored in sanity. Maintaining a repyrity the internal domestic peace was further threatened as the winter of Mortneen Tam Bay deepened, bringing with it a sharp dangerous of the French Empire. In the aggressive military movements of the French Empire, Napoleon Bonaparte issued the Berlin Decrees, establishing the Continental System, a massive, sweeping economic blockade designed to destroy British commerce by point-blank forbidding any European nation from trading with the British Isles. The economic pressure in London began to mount rapidly, causing widespread financial anxiety and public unrest that reverberated through the political factions of Parliament. Queen Charlotte found herself forced back into a state of high-alert defensive warfare, working late into the candlelit nights, with the new Prime Minister, the Duke of Portland, to ensure that the frantic alarmist reports of rioting in the northern manufacturing towns were quietly filtered and softened, before being presented to the vulnerable sovereign. As the year drew to its definitive close, the old patterns of their mutual devotion remained the only absolute, unshakable truth left in a world that was rapidly fracturing into chaos. In the quiet evening hours, when the massive silver candelabras were lit and the Berkshire fog pressed heavily against the high-arched windows of the saloon, George and Charlotte would sit close together by the roaring hearth fire, because the king could no longer admire the intricate details of the rare botanical drawings his wife had collected. He would simply hold her hand, his sensitive fingertips tracing the smooth, worn contours of her skin, finding in the familiar, steady cadence of her breathing a profound sense of inner peace. They were two aging, battle-worn souls, navigating the darkening winter of their long lives that no continental blockade, nor the cruel Marchheim could ever hope to conquer, their hearts bound tightly by a love that remained entirely undefeated by the shadows. The arrival of Mortneen Tam Tam brought no relief to the aging sovereigns. As the fires of the Napoleonic Wars shifted to the Iberian Peninsula, igniting the brutal Peninsular War and casting an immediate, heavy shadow over the private chambers of Windsor Castle. When Napoleon treacherously deposed the Spanish royal family and installed his brother Joseph on the throne in Madrid, the entire Spanish nation rose in a desperate, bloody rebellion. Great Britain instantly seized the opportunity to strike a definitive blow against the French Empire, sending an expeditionary force under the command of Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, to land on the rocky shores of Portugal. For King George III, this new military front was a source of intense, unceasing psychological focus. Although the grey milk of his advanced cataracts had now reduced his world to an absolute, permanent twilight, his strategic mind remained sharp and he demanded constant, detailed briefings on the troop movements, shipping losses, and supply lines feeding the British Army across the sea. For Queen Charlotte, this sudden escalation of the global conflict represented an immediate, terrifying threat to the fragile neural architecture of her husband's mind. She recognized with a battle-hardened clarity that the chaotic unpredictable of a long-distance campaign, filled with the constant threat of military disasters and high casualty lists, was a dangerous catalyst that could easily trigger a fourth catastrophic recurrence of his hidden Baobeng illness. Her hypervigilance reached a state of near-military discipline within the castle walls. She established a strict system alongside her daughters to act as an emotional buffer for the blind sovereign. Every courier who arrived from London via Capite had urgent dispatches from the War Office was required to wait in the outer antechamber, while Charlotte personally reviewed the reports, carefully organising the information so that the king could comprehend the strategic reality without being overwhelmed by the sudden, graphic horrors of the battlefield. This state of high-alert defensive warfare further tightened the invisible, gilded bars of the nunnery around the remaining princesses, Princess Augusta, Princess Elizabeth, and Princess Mary, now mature women whose youth had been entirely sacrificed to the preservation of the crown, found themselves serving as literal geographic eyes for their blind father, because the king could no longer look upon the grand leather-bound maps of Spain and Portugal that lay spread across his massive oak library table. The princesses were required to sit by his side for hours, their voices low and steady, as they meticulously described the terrain, tracing the lines of the Tagus River with their fingers, detailing the mountain passes of the Sierra Morena and moving small ivory marker blocks across the parchment to represent the positions of Wellesley-esque regiments. The old king would lean forward in intense concentration, his sensitive ears drinking in their descriptions, his mind mapping the campaign in the darkness of his sight, entirely dependent on his daughter's vocal fidelity to navigate the expanding boundaries of his empire. The internal domestic strain was further exacerbated by the deep, echoing loneliness that had begun to settle over the royal marriage. Because Charlotte was forced to spend her days managing the political factions of the court and protecting the king from the predatory ambitions of the Prince of Wales, she had less time to simply sit as his companion. The king frequently experienced him in his blindness, reaching out his trembling hands into the empty air of his study, calling for his Charlotte Vere Capite hat. A tragic, childlike vulnerability. Whenever she heard his voice echoing down the drafty stone corridors, the old queen would drop her official papers and hurry to his side, her own body aching with the burning agony of her advanced arthritis. She would take his worn hand into her own, gently rubbing his knuckles until the frantic trembling subsided, reminding him that as long as she drew breath, he would never be left alone in the dark. As the winter of Morning Tam Tam closed in, wrapping Berkshire in a dense freezing fog that blurred the outlines of the ancient forest trees, the aging couple found their ultimate comfort in the shared memories of their youth. In the quiet hours of the late evening, when the massive silver candelabras were lit and the rest of the household had fallen silent, George would sit close to Charlotte's harpsichord. Though he could no longer play his flute, he would close his blind eyes and listen as her thinned, stiffened fingers carefully navigated the familiar, sweeping melodies of Handel that they had played together 40 years earlier at Buckingham House. In these stolen moments of musical harmony, the terrifying realities of the Peninsular War, the betrayals of their sons, and the cruel progression of old age seemed to evaporate, leaving only two hearts bound together by a symmetrical devotion that remained entirely undefeated by the encroaching shadows. The year Morning Tamchin opened with a devastating combination of public scandal and carefully managed peace Queen Charlotte had established within Windsor. Castle. In the early months of the year, the political landscape of London rocked by a massive Pimillinges's second son into the King-S, Prince Frederick, the Duke of York and Commander-in-Chief of the Army. It was revealed that his former mistress, Mary Ann Clark, had been covertly accepting bribes from ambitious military officers in exchange for utilising her influence over the Duke to secure promotions and appointments. The salacious details of the inquiry were printed daily in the national newspapers into an absolute target of public mockery and moral outrage. The Duke of York was ultimately forced to resign his military command in absolute disgrace, a bitter humiliation that struck a near-fatal blow to the old king, unyielding belief in the moral integrity of his lineage. For Queen Charlotte, the management of this public disaster required a state of hypervigilance that pushed her physical and mental endurance to its breaking point. She recognised with a chilling, visceral terror that the knowledge of his favourite son's public degradation could easily shatter the delicate, repaired neural networks within the King's brain, triggering a rapid descent back into the chaotic abyss of his hidden Baobeng illness. She immediately ordered an absolute blockade on all incoming political prints and newspapers, establishing a strict defensive boundary around the King's study. She and her eldest daughters worked in perfect, quiet synchronization to intercept any whispered court gossip, ensuring that when the Duke of York came to Windsor to personally confess his errors to his blind father, the conversation was heavily monitored and kept within a framework of quiet family reconciliation rather than political recrimination. Yet, as devastating as the public scandal was, It paled in comparison to the agonizing domestic tragedy that was beginning to unfold within the deepest recesses of the private family apartments. Princess Amelia, the youngest, gentlest, and most deeply the third, and Queen Charlotte, began to fail rapidly in health. Born in Mottin Beitam Tambar, with Amelia had always been the brightest light in the old king's shrinking world. The child who sweet his cold royal reserve and soothed his racing mind and soothed his ranging when all the cruel medicine of the physicians had utterly failed. But by the summer of Motnin Tam Chin, a vicious wasting illness, compounded by a painful skin infection, locked its permanent, lethal grip upon her fragile 26-year-old body, confining her to a bed of constant suffering. Because the king was no Auvert kept entirely blind, and could not see the heartbreaking physical devastation that the illness was wreaking babies upon his daughter Var's once vibrant face, he relied completely on his heightened senses of hearing and touch to monitor her condition. He insisted on being guided to her bedchamber every single afternoon, his slow, deliberate footsteps echoing tragically down the stone corridors of Windsor. He would sit quietly on the edge of her mattress for hours, tenderly taking her thinned, feverish hand into his own worn grasp. He would use his sensitive fingertips to softly trace the lines of her wrist, measuring her rapid, shallow pulse with a quiet, agonizing intensity, while murmuring old childhood stories to her, completely refusing to accept the terrifying reality that his favorite child was slowly slipping away into the permanent darkness. For Queen Charlotte, the sight of her youngest daughter dying, while her husband sat blind of the danger, was an emotional catastrophe that hardened her defensive mask into an icy monument of grief. She found herself torn between two devastating duties. She had to comfort her dying child, while simultaneously maintaining a flawless illusion of optimism for her husband, knowing that if the king processed the absolute certainty of Amelia's impending death, his sanity would be permanently destroyed. She moved through the dim, candlelit corridors of Windsor like a silent ghost, her own body bent with the burning agony of her advanced arthritis, her hands tightly clasped in constant, silent prayer as the dark winter of Mottin Chin closed in around her family, absolutist secure in her devotion yet, entirely aware that the greatest historical storm of their lives was about to break. The year Motnin Tamur arrived with the slow, crushing inevitability of a winter frost that no amount of royal wealth or protective hypervigilance could stall. Within the isolated chambers of Windsor Castle, the dual reality of national sovereignty and domestic agony converged upon the House of Hanover with devastating force. It was the year of the King's Golden Jubilee, marking 50 years since a young idealistic George III had ascended the British throne. Outside the palace walls, the streets of London and Windsor erupted in grand public celebrations, with massive fireworks illuminating the autumn sky and crowds raising their voices in patriotic toasts to the longevity of their monarch. But inside the dark, drafty corridors of the castle, the atmosphere felt like a gilded mausoleum. The old king, now entirely blind and deeply weathered by the years, sat in his library, unable to see the banners raised in his honour, his mind wholly consumed not by the global triumphs of his empire, but by the shallow, rattling breaths of his youngest daughter dying just down the hall. Princess Amelia's condition had degenerated into a state of agonizing, permanent crisis by the autumn of Motnin Tamur. The wasting to tuberculosis had stripped the 27-year-old princess, leaving her fragile frame confined bay to a bed draped in heavy velvet. King George, navigating the pitch-black world of his cataracts, maintained his sacred daily ritual of visiting her bedside. Because he was spared the visual horror of her emaciated form, he clung with a desperate, frantic optimism to the illusion that she might still recover. He would sit on the edge of her mattress, his sensitive fingertips resting against her feverish skin, his ears entirely tuned to the changing cadence of her voice. Amelia, deeply aware that her impending departure would likely shatter the final delicate threads holding her father's sanity together, chose to encapsulate her boundless love for him in a final, tangible token that would outlast her physical breath. In the quiet weeks of October, as the pale English sun cast cold shadows across her bedchamber, Amelia secretly commissioned a local Windsor jeweller to craft a unique mourning ring. The band was fashioned from solid gold, housing a lock of her own dark hair beneath a small, pristine crystal face, bordered by a delicate ring of pearls. On the interior of the band, she had the jeweller engrave a simple heartbreaking plea: "Remember me when Mott am gone." On a crisp afternoon near the end of the month, during what would be their final conscious earthly meeting, Amelia gathered her remaining strength, took her father's worn, trembling hand, and gently slipped the ring onto his finger. The moment the blind king's fingertips recognized the unmistakable texture of a mourning ring, and the moment he realized the tragic, definitive message his darling daughter was sending him, the carefully constructed dam around his sanity collapsed forever. The psychological impact of Amelia's farewell gift tore through George's mind like a sudden violent tempest, plunged him back into the howling, chaotic abyss of his hidden Bao-Baeng illness. His speech instantly accelerated into an unmanageable, breathless torrent of fractured memories, invisible angels and fragmented historical events, continuing for hours without a single moment of rest. When Princess Amelia finally closed her eyes, forever on November the 2nd, Mortin Tam Mui, the old king was already completely lost within the labyrinth of his own mind. Insulated from the real world by a permanent fog of delusions, he was unable to process the reality of her funeral, nor could he understand why the massive iron bells of St. George's Chapel were tolling their heavy, rhythmic grief across the frosted parklands of Windsor. For Queen Charlotte, the double blow of losing her youngest, gentlest child, and witnessing the permanent psychological death of her husband was an emotional catastrophe that broke her spirit in a way that 49 years of political warfare had never managed. The old fierce queen sat alone in her dark dressing room, listening to the muffled, unceasing sound of her husband's manic voice echoing through the heavy oak door that separated their apartments. She looked down at her own arthritic hands, realizing with an absolute, chilling clarity that the man she had married in just 6 hours, the husband who had built a sanctuary for her at Buckingham House and refused to ever take a mistress, was gone forever. He was trapped in an invisible prison of the mind, where even her iron-willed devotion could no longer reach him, leaving her to face the cold twilight of the British Empire as a solitary, silent sentry. The arrival of Mortin Tam Mort brought a harsh, definitive political winter to the British Empire, permanently shifting the axis of power from the dark, quiet chambers of Windsor Castle to the glittering, decadent halls of Carlton House. With King George III now completely lost inside the unyielding white labyrinth of his permanent delusions, the political apparatus in London wasted no time in securing the continuity of the state. In February of that year, Parliament officially passed the Regency Act, stripping the mad king of his executive authority and appointing his eldest son as Prince Regent. For the prince, this milestone was the signal for an era of unprecedented extravagance, spent drowning his debts in rivers of claret and redesigning his palaces with public funds. But for Queen Charlotte, the passage of the Act was a bitter, exhausting defeat that finalized the destruction of the royal world she had spent 50 years building. Yet, amid the legal restructuring of the realm, Charlotte successfully fought a fierce, desperate rearguard battle in Parliament to extract a single sacred concession. Under the terms of the Regency Bill, she was granted absolute exclusive legal custody of the king's physical person and the total management of his royal household. This was not a political triumph for the aging queen, but a heavy, grueling sentence of matrimonial duty that she accepted at the Samwit marriage vows of her original Bedtime ward, Mot Femme Sounds, now a worn, fragile woman in her late 60s, her spine deeply bent by the burning agony of advanced arthritis. Charlotte stood as an immovable iron gatekeeper between her vulnerable husband and a cynical predatory court that was more than ready to forget his existence. Windsor Castle was effectively split into two entirely different worlds, separated by a thick barrier of stone and silence. On the upper floors and the southern terraces, the Prince Regent held magnificent diplomats and fashionable London society, the air filled with the sounds of laughter, society. The police clinking crystal and orchestral waltzes, but in the deep isolated north wing, the old king lived out his days in a quiet, shadowy exile. Charlotte established a rigid, unyielding protocol for the small group of physicians, pages, and orderlies who managed his daily care. She point-blank forbade any politician, curious courtier, or member of the public from the incapacitated monarch, fiercely defending him from the mocking, speculative gaze of the press. She insisted that even though his mind was gone, he must always be treated in reverence due to a reigning king, ensuring his hair was neatly brushed, his white linen was clean, and his meals were served on fine silver plate. Because the physicians still argued that Charlotte's direct physical presence could trigger sudden asphyxia in the king's frantic pulse, the Queen was forced to live a heartbreaking life of absolute proximity without contact. She moved her own private apartments to a suite of rooms directly adjacent to his wing, separating their daily existences by a single heavy oak door. Every single afternoon, Charlotte would sit quietly in her armchair, her embroidery frame resting untouched in her lap, her ears completely tuned to the muffled, tragic sounds drifting through the wood panels. She could hear the rhythmic and unceasing pacing of his slippered feet across the hardwood floors, and the low, breathless murmur of his voice as he played his favourite hand sonata, a small harpsichord, or held lengthy animated conversations. Verkep, he had invisible angels and long-dead prime ministers. It was a life of profound, echoing loneliness, yet she refused to leave his side, remaining his silent midnight sentry. This constant state of hypervigilance and domestic isolation took a devastating toll on Charlotte's own health, hardening her once gentle disposition into a severe, defensive discipline that strained her relationships with her remaining children. Yet, beneath the hard, defensive shell of the aging queen, the pure flame of her original devotion remained entirely untouched. She lived solely for the preservation of his peace, finding her only comfort in the knowledge that as long as she drew breath, the stranger she had married in just 6 hours would never be abandoned to the cruel indifference of an asylum. She sat under the dim, flickering amber light of a dying candle, her frail hands clasped tightly in prayer, keeping watch over the monarch who had once given her an empire, waiting for the long night of their earthly separation to finally give way to the dawn. The year Motten High opened with the grand, sweeping theatre of the Napoleonic Wars reaching its terrifying frozen climax across the European continent, yet the echoes of these global tremors were reduced to mere ambient whispers by the time they reached the thick stone walls of Windsor Castle's north wing. In London, the Prince Regent and his ministers were consumed by the frantic coordination of the Peninsular Campaign and the shocking news of Napoleon's catastrophic invasion of Russia. The map of the civilized world was being redrawn in blood, but inside the private universe of King George III, time had ceased to flow in a linear path. The old king, now completely blind and insulated by a permanent shroud of mental fog, lived in an eternal pastoral summer of his own mind. He was entirely unaware that his kingdom was locked in a death match with the French Empire. Instead, he spent his long mornings walking across the thick carpets of his chamber, organising invisible parliaments and reviewing spectral regiments of guards that existed only behind his dark eyes. For Queen Charlotte, the year Motnintam Mi High brought a profound, exhausting consolidation of her solitary role as the guardian of the king's person. The political landscape around her had grown increasingly hostile and transactional. The Prince Regent, comfortable in his unchecked executive authority, made frequent attempts to reduce the financial budget allocated for the maintenance of his father's household. At Windsor, viewing the immaculate care of the Mad King as an unnecessary drain on the state funds he desired for his architectural extravagances, Charlotte confronted these fiscal incursions with the fierce, unyielding fury of a mother lion defending her den. Despite her advanced age and the relentless burning pain of the arthritis that now distorted the joints of her fingers and knees, she personally audited every single household expense, point-blank refusing to allow a single candle to be dimmed or a single silver plate to be removed from her husband's apartments. The weight of this defensive vigil, however, continued to extract a devastating silent toll on the remaining princesses trapped within the domestic fortress of Windsor. Princess Augusta and Princess Mary, now entering their 40s verkepute had their youth completely vanished into the shadows of the palace, found themselves serving as the primary physical buffers between their mother's hardening discipline and the cruel realities of the outside world. The atmosphere inside their shared sitting rooms had grown heavy, claustrophobic, and stained with an unspoken, lingering grief. The princesses spent their long, drafty afternoons engaging in endless charitable needlework, their fingers moving in a dull, rhythmic synchronization while the muffled, frantic sounds of their father's voice singing. Handel fragments drifted through the heavy oak doors, a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the living ghost they were protecting. As the winter of Mottentam Mui High gave way to the sweeping global triumphs and Mottentam Mui Boom, witnessing the definitive collapse of Napoleon's empire, and the triumphant entry of Allied sovereigns into Paris, London, erupted in an unprecedented wave of ecstatic patriotic celebration. Grand victory galas, illuminated frost fairs, and majestic military parades filled the streets of the capital with a roaring, chaotic energy. But inside the north wing of Windsor, Queen Charlotte maintained an ironclad embargo against the noise of the outside world. She knew with an absolute hyper-vigilant certainty that the sudden, explosive sound of celebratory cannons or the chaotic visual glare of victory bonfires outside the windows could trigger a violent, dangerous spike in the king's pulse. She ordered the thick velvet curtains of his chambers to be permanently drawn, insulating his dark twilight from the historical triumphs achieved in his name. In the quiet midnight hours of these historic years, when the grand victory balls were dancing late into the night at Carlton House, the aging queen would sit alone by the fading embers of her sitting-room hearth, her ears completely tuned to the steady pacing footsteps of her husband through the adjacent door, because she could no longer hold his hand or look into his eyes without risking his psychological stability. Her entire emotional existence had been reduced to this auditory connection. She listened to the low, breathless cadence of his voice as he conversed with long-dead childhood friends, finding a profound, tragic comfort in the simple knowledge that his heart was still beating and that his immaculate royal dignity remained entirely intact beneath her watch. She was a solitary, war-torn queen keeping guard over a lost king, their symmetrical devotion remaining the one pure, unbroken thread of gold in an empire that had already begun to forget their sacrifice. The year Mottentam Mui Lam arrived with a sudden, electrifying tremor that briefly shook the foundations of the civilized world, yet the grand, definitive climax of the Napoleonic era remained completely powerless to break the deep silent spell that held Windsor Castle's north wing in its grip. In March, the terrifying news reached London that Napoleon Bonaparte had escaped his exile on the island of Elba, landing on the southern coast of France and marching triumphantly toward Paris to resurrect his empire. The continent was instantly plunged back into a state of frantic military mobilization, culminating in June with the bloody apocalyptic clash at the Battle of Waterloo. There, the Duke of Wellington achieved the ultimate definitive triumph that permanently crushed Napoleon's ambitions and brought a lasting peace to Europe. But inside the dark, isolated chambers of the old king, the roaring cannons of Waterloo did not cause a single ripple of disruption. George III sat in his high-backed armchair, his long, snow-white beard falling over his chest, his blind eyes fixed on a horizon that existed only within his own permanent illusions. For Queen Charlotte, the year Montam marked the beginning of a quiet, agonizing physical decline that signaled the approach of her own definitive winter. The relentless compounding toll of 54 years of emotional endurance, combined with the crushing, unceasing trauma of her husband's Beng illness, had completely shattered her physical frame. Her hands, which had gracefully played the harpsichord for Mozart and tenderly pressed rare botanical specimens from the New World, were now heavily distorted by the burning fire of advanced arthritis. Every movement required a monumental, exhausting effort of will, yet even as her body began to fail her, her hyper-vigilant mind remained fiercely, beautifully locked onto the preservation of the king's immaculate dignity. She point-blank refused to surrender her legal custody over his household, continuing to personally audit every expense and review every medical report from her adjacent sitting room, her spirit serving as an iron fortress that no passing storm could dismantle. This period of post-war transition, however, continued to demand an unyielding, heartbreaking sacrifice from the princesses living within the silent boundaries of Windsor. Princess Augusta and Princess Mary, now mature women whose entire youth had been consumed by the domestic defence of the crown, found themselves serving as primary physical nurses for both of their failing parents. The old king's psychological dependency on his daughter's voices had reached a state of absolute necessity. Because his world was entirely black, the soft, rhythmic cadence of their speech served as his only structural orientation within the room. They spent their long, drafty afternoons reading aloud the accounts of Wellington's victories and the diplomatic restructuring of Europe, their own personal dreams of independent lives, and entirely buried beneath the stone floors of the castle to maintain the fragile illusion of stability that kept their father anchored in sanity. The internal family dynamic was further complicated as the winter of Montam deepened, bringing a series of deep economic anxieties to the British population. The high cost of the long war had left the nation burdened with massive debts, causing widespread public unrest and political protest that frequently reached the gates of the royal residences in London. Queen Charlotte found herself forced back into a state of high-alert defensive warfare, working late into the candlelit nights with her advisors to ensure that the frantic reports of industrial rioting in the northern towns were quietly filtered and softened before they could penetrate, and softened would come the heavy oak doors of the king's apartments. She became a solitary, silent sentry, absorbing the shocks of a changing world before they could damage the fragile machinery of her husband's mind, her devotion remaining the one pure, unblemished truth in a collapsing century. As the final weeks of the year drew to a close, wrapping the Berkshire landscape in a dense, freezing fog that blurred the outlines of the ancient forest trees, the aging king and queen found their ultimate solace in the quiet, shared rhythms of their isolation. In the late evening hours, when the massive silver candelabras were lit and the rest of the household had retired to sleep, Charlotte would sit by the adjacent door, her ears completely tuned to the steady pacing footsteps of her husband through the wood panelling, because she could no longer cross the threshold without risking his stability. Her entire emotional existence had been reduced to this auditory connection. She listened to the low, breathless murmur of his voice as he played fragments of Handel sonatas on his small harpsichord, finding a profound, tragic comfort in the simple knowledge that his heart was still beating beneath her watch. absolutely secure in a symmetrical loyalty that remained entirely undefeated by the encroaching shadows. The arrival of Motin Tammi Sao and Motin Tammi Bey brought a profound, deeply emotional shift to the domestic fortress of Windsor Castle, as the long-withheld desires of the remaining princesses began to collide with the fading strength of their aging mother. In the summer of Motin Tammi Sao, Princess Mary, now a mature woman of 40, achieved a rare, hard-won liberation from the nunnery. With Queen Charlotte's reluctant blessing, Mary was wed to her cousin, the Duke of Gloucester, finally stepping past the heavy velvet curtains that had imprisoned her youth. But for Princess Augusta, who remained behind as the solitary daughter in attendance, the departure of her sister only intensified the crushing weight of her filial duties. The old king, living in the pitch-black twilight of his advanced cataracts and permanent delusions, frequently called out into the empty air of his chamber for Mary. His sensitive ears deeply unsuff her footsteps, requiring Augusta to endlessly repeat gentle, fictional explanations to soothe his rising anxiety. For Queen Charlotte, this period of family transition was completely overshadowed by a rapid, agonizing decline in her own physical health. By the autumn of Motin Tam Bey, a severe condition of dropsy, a painful accumulation of fluid within the tissues, had locked its irreversible grip upon her 73-year-old body. Her breath grew increasingly shallow, and the burning fire of her advanced arthritis made it nearly impossible for her to navigate even the dressing room and her bed without the physical support of her pages. Bierzegürin Hamind. Yet, despite her immense suffering, the old queen's hyper-vigilant mind remained beautifully locked onto the protection of the king's person. She stubbornly refused to surrender her legal custody over his household, continuing to sit at her small mahogany desk under the dim light of a single candle, her deformed fingers trembling as she signed the daily maintenance orders for the North Wing. But the true shattering catastrophe of Motin Tammi Bey struck the House of Hanover from the outside world in November of that year, sending a wave of profound national shock that penetrated the thick stone walls of Windsor. The only child of the Prince Regent and the sole legitimate grandchild of King George III and Queen Charlotte passed away at the tragic age of 21 after giving birth to a stillborn son. The sudden catastrophic death of the young princess, who had been idolised by the British public as the future hope of the monarchy, plunged the entire empire into an unprecedented state of weeping public grief. Black mourning banners draped the streets of London, and the iron bells of every parish church in the realm told a heavy rhythmic sorrow for the lost succession. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the North Wing, Queen Charlotte immediately mobilised her remaining strength to enforce an absolute ironclad embargo against the tragic news. She recognised with a chilling certainty that if the knowledge of his beloved granddaughter's death managed to penetrate the fragile machinery of the King-S mind, the emotional shock would trigger a violent, dangerous spike in his pulse that his thinned physical frame could not survive. She ordered the thick oak doors to his apartments to be permanently locked to all outside couriers, and she strictly forbade any servant from whispering the name of Princess Charlotte within the corridors. The old king sat in his backed armchair, completely insulated from the dynastic nightmare that had devastated his lineage, his long, snow-white beard brushing against his chest as he softly played frag of Handel's sonata to small harpsichord, wholly secure in his beautiful imaginary world. As the freezing winds of the Motin Tammi Bey winter closed in around Berkshire, wrapping the ancient oaks of the great park in a dense silver frost, the king and queen lived out their final months of shared earthly existence, separated by a single heavy barrier of wood and silence. Every single afternoon, despite the suffocating weight in her chest, Charlotte would have her chair wheeled close to the adjacent door. She would sit perfectly still for hours, her embroidery frame resting untouched in her lap, her ears completely tuned to the low, breathless murmur of her husband's voice as he held lengthy, animated conversations with invisible angels. It was an agonizing life of absolute proximity without physical touch, yet she refused to abandon her watch, remaining his silent midnight secretary until her own final hour, their symmetrical devotion remaining completely undefeated by the gathering shadows of the night. The year Motnin Tam Mir Tam arrived with the heavy, unmistakable stillness of a final winter, as the long, magnificent tapestry of Queen Charlotte's 57-year vigil began to unravel from her failing physical grasp. By the spring of that year, the agonizing progression of her dropsy had made it entirely impossible for her to remain within the drafty, vertical spaces of Windsor Castle. Seeking a more confined, manageable sanctuary for her final months, she was carefully moved to Kew Palace. The small George had spent their happiest where she and George had spent their happiest, most informal summers 40 years earlier. Yet, even as her lungs filled Vekepitahat fluid, and her thinned frame became permanently confined to a heavy mahogany armchair, the old Queen's hyper-vigilant mind remained fiercely locked onto her marital duty. She point-blank refused to relinquish her legal custody of the King's person, continuing to command daily, detailed couriers from Windsor to report on the exact cadence of his breathing and the cleanliness of his linen. Back in the isolated north wing of Windsor, King George III remained completely blind to the fact that his beloved companion of nearly 6 decades had left the building. Hidden within the white, peaceful fog of his permanent delusions, his auditory world was entirely occupied by the ghost of his youth. He would sit at his small harpsichord for hours, his sensitive fingers navigating the familiar keys, holding long, cheerful conversations with an invisible Charlotte, whom his mind insisted was still sitting in the dressing room next door. He would ask his pages to convey his fondest regards to the Queen. He would, entirely insulated from the tragic reality that she was gasping for her remaining breaths 30 miles away on the banks of the Thames, her spirit serving as an iron shield for his dignity until the absolute end. As the golden leaves of autumn began to drift across the lawns of Kew in November of Motnin Tam Mi Tam, it became clear to the royal physicians that Queen Charlotte's long night of earthly endurance was reaching its definitive close. On the morning of November the 17th, she sat in her favoured bedroom, the Prince Regent, her younger son, the Duke of York, and her devoted daughter, Princess Augusta, that had defined her 49 years of court warfare, had entirely softened. Replaced by a profound, serene exhaustion, she looked out the window at the pale English sun breaking through the river mist, her breath slowing into a gentle, rhythmic whisper. With her hand resting securely within the grasp of her children, the 74-year-old Queen quietly closed her eyes and Trut Ho Yi Ter, Kui Kung drew her final breath, passing peacefully from the world without a single groan. The legal and political apparatus of London instantly moved to mark her departure with the grand, sombre pageantry required of a queen consort. Her body was placed inside a heavy mahogany coffin draped in black velvet, and a majestic funeral procession escorted her back to Berkshire, the horses moving at a slow, funereal pace over cobblestones that had been specially layered with thick straw to muffle the sound. Yet the most heartbreaking historical detail of that solemn winter day occurred as the procession entered the gates of Windsor Castle. The coffin was carried directly beneath the windows of the north wing, where the blind king sat in absolute, motionless silence. Because his family had fiercely maintained Charlotte's embargo against tragic news, George was entirely unaware that the heavy iron wheels passing beneath his chamber were carrying the body of his place in the vaults of St. George's Chapel, St. George Handel. With Charlotte's departure, the solitary task of maintaining the king's sanctuary fell squarely upon the shoulders of Princess Augusta and a small circle of fiercely loyal pages. They maintained the Queen's rigid protocol with a sacred precision, ensuring that the blind, mad monarch remained completely insulated from the changing politics of the outside world. As the winter of Mortem Mirtam closed its icy grip around Windsor, wrapping the ancient oak trees in a thick silver frost, George III sat close by his library fire, his long, snow-white beard brushing against his chest, his fingers tracing the gold wedding band that had bound his soul to Charlotte in Orkney's Bay Saumi Mott. He was a lonely king living in a kingdom of shadows, yet he remained absolutely secure in the beautiful illusion of her presence, their symmetrical devotion outliving the very breath of the Queen, who had destroyed her own life to keep him safe in the light. The arrival of Mortin Tam Chin wrapped the north wing of Windsor Castle in an absolute permanent twilight as the blind and isolated King George III entered. Vekep Hatate would be the final full year of his monumental reign. Outside the heavy stone battlements, the world was moving forward at a breathless modern pace. The Prince Regent was already orchestrating the lavish architectural transformation of London, and the Industrial Revolution was rapidly redrawing the social landscape of the British Empire. Yet inside the king's private suite, time had dissolved into an unchanging pastoral dream. The old monarch, now 78 years old, lived as a serene ghost within his own palace, because the loyal pages and Princess Augusta continued to strictly enforce Queen Charlotte's final embargo against any tragic news. George remained entirely blissfully unaware that his beloved wife had been sleeping in the cold stone vault of St. George's Chapel for months. In his mind, she had simply gone for a long walk through the botanical gardens of Kew, and he confidently expected her return hat every passing sunset. Without the physical presence of Charlotte, the monumental burden of preserving the king, immaculate royal dignity fell squarely upon the shoulders of Princess Augusta and a small, dedicated staff of royal attendants. They executed this duty with a sacred, near-religious precision that mirrored the deceased Queen's iron-willed standards. Every morning the blind king was gently bathed, his long snow-white hair and magnificent, flowing silver beard were meticulously brushed, and he was dressed in his favoured purple velvet suit adorned with the glittering star of the Order of the Garter. Even though no foreign ambassadors or London politicians were ever permitted to cross the threshold of the North Wing, his meals were still served on fine silver plate, and the orderlies addressed him with the absolute pristine reverence due to a reigning sovereign. Augusta had transformed his confinement into a beautiful protective sanctuary, ensuring that the old king was never stripped of his majesty by the cruel indifference of his illness. As the months of Motten Tamwi Ba and Motten Tam Chin blurred together in his dark world, George's auditory senses became his primary gateway to an invisible kingdom. He spent his long afternoons seated at a small, specially modified harpsichord that had been placed near the window. His sensitive, thinned fingers, though stiffened by age, could still navigate the ivory keys with a surprising instinctive accuracy. The grand, sweeping chords of his revered master, George Friedrich Handel, would fill the draughty, high-ceilinged saloons, cutting through the heavy Berkshire fog that pressed against the glass. As he played, the old king would hold long, cheerful conversations with invisible spirits, long-dead prime ministers like William Pitt and his favourite departed daughter Amelia. He lived in a beautiful, non-linear reality, where everyone he had ever loved was still vibrant, young, and waiting for him just outside the door, entirely insulated from the tragic dynastic fractures that were occurring in the real world. For Princess Augusta, sitting quietly in the corner of the room with her embroidery frame, watching her father converse hat, ghosts was a source of profound, weeping heartbreak. She had sacrificed her own youth, her personal dreams of marriage, and her independence to stand as a solitary sentry in this palace of shadows. Yet, whenever she witnessed the serene, radiant smile that would cross her father's weathered face as he listened to his imaginary angels, she understood the divine value of her sacrifice. She became the vocal anchor that kept him safe within his peaceful illusions. Whenever his hands would tremble with a sudden, passing moment of disorientation in his blindness, Augusta would instantly step to his side, speaking to him in the steady, reassuring tones he had loved since her childhood, gently guiding his fingers back to the familiar texture of the harpsichord keys. As the deep, freezing winter of Motneen Tam-Michin closed its icy grip around Berkshire, painting the ancient oak trees of the great park in a dense shroud of silver frost, the old king's physical strength began to fail rapidly. His steps across the thick carpets grew shorter, and he spent more hours resting his head against the high velvet back of his armchair. Yet even as his thinned frame grew weak, his fingers would frequently reach down to touch the smooth, worn gold wedding band on his finger, the timeless symbol of the symmetrical devotion that had bound his soul to Charlotte in Mort Bay Saumi Mort. He was a lonely monarch preparing to leave a kingdom of shadows. Absolutely secure in was waiting for him in the next room, their love remaining the one pure, unbroken golden thread that the darkness of madness and the march of time could never hope to conquer. The month of January Mortam Haimui arrived over Berkshire like a long, drawn-out sigh, bringing a bitter, unrelenting frost that completely froze the waters of the Thames and wrapped the massive battlements of Windsor Castle in a permanent shroud of silver ice. Inside the deeply isolated chambers of the North Wing, the long historic twilight of King George III was finally narrowing down to its final hours. At 81 years of age, after nearly 60 years upon the British throne, the old king's magnificent physical resilience had reached its natural absolute boundary. He could no longer chew his food, his thinned frame had grown too weak to support his weight, even within the deep cushions of his armchair, and he lay confined to his bed, his breathing slowing into a gentle rhythmic whisper that grew shallower vekep haite at each passing sunset. For Princess Augusta and the small circle of loyal pages who had Gete watch over his dark exile, these final days were approached with a quiet, sacred solemnity. They maintained Queen Charlotte's protective protocol with an unyielding precision until the absolute end. The air in the royal bedchamber was kept perfectly warm by a roaring hearth fire. The scent of lavender oil drifted through the dim light of the silver candelabras, and no political couriers or ambitious politicians from London were permitted to cross the threshold. Even as the old monarch hovered on the fragile threshold between life and death, he remained completely wrapped in the pristine dignity that his sovereign status required. His snow-white hair neatly brushed against the pillows, his mind still entirely insulated from the cold, changing realities of the outside world. Within the deep non-linear landscape of his permanent delusions, the king experienced no terror, nor did he feel the heavy weight of his physical decay. The white fog that had long protected his sanity had now transformed into a beautiful, radiant light. He lay perfectly still, his blind eyes closed, his sensitive ears no longer tracking the real sounds of the room, but listening instead to a magnificent, celestial choir playing the grandest movements of Handel's Messiah. He held soft, murmured conversations with invisible angels, his voice dropping to a low, emotional whisper as he called out the names of his departed loved ones, his darling daughter Amelia, his sister Augusta, and his loyal friend William Pitt, fully believing that they were standing at the foot of his bed, smiling and waiting to welcome him home. On the evening of January the 29th Mortum Tam Haimi, as the heavy iron bells of Windsor town began to chime the hour of 8, a sudden profound stillness settled over the royal bedchamber. Princess Augusta knelt by the side of the mattress, tenderly taking her father's worn, cooling hand into her own grasp. The old king drew one final deep breath, his weathered face softening into an expression of absolute, radiant peace, and without a single groan or struggle, he quietly trut hui ter. Kui Kung drew his final breath, passing peacefully into the permanent dawn. The long reign of the mad, blind monarch who had lost an empire but won the enduring love of his people was officially over, and the crown passed instantly to his extravagant son, who would rule as George IV. But the true magnificent climax of this century-long story occurred far beyond the political ledger of the British Empire. The moment George III closed his eyes to the earth, his soul was instantly liberated of his cataracts, and the chaotic black prison of his cataracts, and the chaotic labyrinth of his madness. In the brilliant, untroubled light of eternity, his sight was miraculously restored, and the very first thing his eyes beheld was the radiant, youthful face of his Charlotte, standing before him without the lines of sorrow or the burning agony of her advanced arthritis. She extended her hand to him with the same gentle submissiveness she had first the storm-tossed ship in Mort Bay Sao Mimot, her voice dropping to a warm, familiar melody as she welcomed him back to her side. They were two battle-worn sovereigns who had survived the storms of global warfare, political betrayal, and domestic catastrophe, finally reunited in a symmetrical devotion that would outlast the very stones of Windsor, their hearts bound together forever in a kingdom where the shadows of darkness could never hope to follow.